The Emperor's grand design for humanity's ascension stretched far beyond the mere conquest of worlds or the reunification of scattered human colonies across the galaxy. His vision encompassed a fundamental transformation of mankind's relationship with the Imperium itself, seeking to sever the species' dangerous dependence on the treacherous currents of the warp. At the heart of this ambition lay the ancient Eldar construct known as the Webway, a vast network of interdimensional tunnels that crisscrossed the galaxy, offering safe passage through a realm that existed parallel to both real space and the warp. The Master of Mankind had observed how the Eldar moved through their labyrinthine passages with impunity, protected from the predations of chaos entities and the unpredictable storms that plagued warp travel. Where human vessels required Geller fields, navigator houses, and constant vigilance against demonic incursion, the Xenos simply stepped through hidden portals and emerged at distant worlds within hours or days rather than months. This technological mastery represented everything the Emperor sought to achieve for his species: freedom from the perils of psyker-guided travel and liberation from the monopolistic stranglehold of the navigator houses. The implications of mastering Webway technology extended beyond mere transportation efficiency. The Emperor understood that humanity's reliance on psykers for interstellar travel created an inherent vulnerability to chaos corruption. Every navigator who gazed into the warp risked madness or possession. Every astropath who transmitted messages across the void invited demonic attention. The very foundations of the Imperium rested upon individuals whose souls burned bright in the Imperium, drawing the hungry gaze of entities that viewed human consciousness as sustenance. By establishing humanity's own network within the Webway, the Emperor envisioned a future where mankind could expand across the galaxy without feeding the dark gods of chaos. Worlds could be connected through stable, permanent passages that required no psychic navigation. Armies could be deployed instantly across vast distances without the delays and dangers of warp translation. Most significantly, humanity could begin to wean itself from its dependence on psykers entirely, gradually reducing the species' psychic footprint in the Imperium until the Chaos Gods found themselves starved of the emotional and spiritual energy that sustained them. The construction of the Imperial Webway, gate beneath the Imperial Palace, represented the most ambitious engineering project ever undertaken by human hands. Deep within the bedrock of Terra, far below the towering spires and golden domes of the palace complex, vast excavations carved out chambers that dwarfed even the greatest cathedral spaces of the surface world. The scale of the undertaking required the displacement of billions of tons of earth and stone, creating artificial caverns that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The Emperor had spent millennia gathering the knowledge necessary for such a feat. Ancient archaeotech recovered from the ruins of the Dark Age of technology provided crucial insights into dimensional manipulation and energy field generation. Fragments of Eldar technology, obtained through conquest or careful negotiation with craftworld seers, revealed the fundamental principles underlying Webway construction. Most controversial of all, the project incorporated forbidden Xenos knowledge that many within the Imperium would have considered heretical, but the Emperor's authority brooked no challenge to his grand design. The archaeotech components formed the backbone of the gate's construction. Massive field generators, their crystalline matrices humming with barely contained energies, created the dimensional rifts necessary to breach the barriers between real space and the Webway's pocket dimension. These devices, relics of humanity's lost golden age, operated on principles that even the most learned tech priests could barely comprehend. Their machine spirits sang with harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions, creating standing wave patterns that could tear holes in reality itself. Eldar Wraithbone constructs, painstakingly reverse-engineered and adapted for human use, provided the structural framework for the gate's aperture. The psychoactive material responded to focused will and intention, shaping itself according to the mental patterns of its operators. Where Eldar seers had once guided the substance through song and meditation, the Emperor's own psychic might force the alien material into configurations that served his purposes. The Wraithbone formed delicate lattices that channeled dimensional energies, creating stable pathways through the chaotic flux of the Webway's boundaries. The integration of these disparate technologies required unprecedented cooperation between the Emperor and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Tech priests from Mars worked alongside the Master of Mankind's own artificers, their augmented minds struggling to comprehend the theoretical frameworks underlying the project. The Mechanicus approached the endeavor with their characteristic blend of reverence and analytical precision, viewing the archaeotech components as sacred relics to be honored even as they sought to unlock their secrets. Magos biologist specialists studied the interaction between human neural patterns and Eldar psychoactive materials, developing interface protocols that allowed human operators to control wraithbone constructs without succumbing to alien mental influences. Their research required extensive experimentation with servitor subjects and volunteer tech priests, mapping the precise frequencies of thought required to manipulate the Xenos material effectively. The Forge Masters of Mars contributed their expertise in large-scale engineering projects, designing the massive support structures necessary to house the gate's components. Adamantium girders, each one a masterwork of metallurgy, formed a framework capable of withstanding the dimensional stresses generated by the gate's operation. Plasma conduits snaked through the structure like arteries, carrying the enormous amounts of energy required to maintain stable portal manifestation. The Golden Throne itself became an integral component of the Webway project, its ancient mechanisms adapted to serve as both control nexus and power source for the dimensional gate. The throne's origins stretched back to the dark age of technology, when human science had achieved heights that seemed godlike by the standards of the 31st millennium. Its psychic amplification systems, originally designed for purposes lost to history, proved capable of channeling and focusing the Emperor's immense psychic might with unprecedented precision. Tech priests worked for years to integrate the throne systems with the Webway gate's control mechanisms. Fiber optic cables, their cores made from crystallized light itself, carried data streams between the two devices at speeds approaching that of thought. Psychic resonance chambers, lined with materials that existed partially outside normal spacetime, allowed the Emperor's consciousness to extend directly into the Webway's dimensional matrix. The modifications required extensive alterations to the Golden Throne's original configuration. Ancient stasis fields were recalibrated to maintain stable dimensional apertures rather than preserving biological tissue. Psychic amplifiers were retuned to broadcast across dimensional boundaries rather than merely through real space. The throne's life support systems were expanded to accommodate the enormous metabolic demands of maintaining constant psychic contact with the Webway's chaotic energies. As construction progressed, the first tentative expeditions into the Webway revealed the true scope of the challenge facing the Imperial project. The tunnels beyond the gate stretched into infinity, their crystalline walls pulsing with energies that defied conventional analysis. Ancient Eldar constructs dotted the pathways like abandoned cities, their spires and domes crafted from materials that seemed to shift between states of matter, according to no physical laws that human science could comprehend. The initial exploration teams consisted of carefully selected volunteers from the Adeptus Custodians, their enhanced physiology and psychic resistance making them ideal candidates for venturing into the alien environment. Each expedition carried extensive sensor equipment designed to map the tunnel networks and analyze the exotic energies that permeated the Webway's structure. The data they returned painted a picture of a realm vast beyond imagination, where distance and direction followed rules that bore little resemblance to those governing real space. The abandoned Eldar constructs presented both opportunity and danger to the Imperial explorers. Some structures appeared to be ancient way stations, their chambers filled with devices whose purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. Crystalline nodes pulsed with residual energy, their faceted surfaces reflecting images of distant star systems and alien worlds. Navigation chambers contained star maps that showed the galaxy from perspectives no human had ever imagined, with pathways marked between worlds that lay thousands of light years apart in real space, but stood mere hours distant through the Webway's twisted geometry. Other constructs bore the unmistakable signs of ancient battles, their walls scarred by weapons that had carved through wraithbone and crystal with equal ease. Blast patterns suggested conflicts fought with energies that existed partially outside normal space-time, leaving damage that continued to propagate through dimensions long after the original battles had ended. These sites radiated a palpable sense of menace that even the psychically resistant Custodians found unsettling, as if the violence of ages past had somehow imprinted itself upon the very structure of the tunnels. The pathways themselves revealed the true scope of the Eldar achievement. Tunnel networks branched and merged according to patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles beyond human comprehension. Some passages led to distant sectors of the galaxy, emerging near worlds that Imperial expeditionary fleets had not yet reached. Others connected to realms that existed entirely outside normal spacetime, pocket dimensions where alien civilizations had once flourished, or where stranger entities still held dominion. The exploration teams discovered that movement through the Webway required more than mere physical traversal. The tunnels responded to mental intention and psychic resonance, with pathways opening or closing based on the thoughts and emotions of those who walked them. Custodians found that their disciplined minds could navigate the simpler routes with relative ease, but the deeper networks required a level of psychic sensitivity that only the Emperor himself possessed. Each expedition returned with new evidence of the Webway's vast potential and equally vast dangers. The tunnel networks offered access to every corner of the galaxy, providing strategic advantages that could reshape the Great Crusade's entire approach to expansion and conquest. Simultaneously, the alien nature of the realm posed challenges that human science was only beginning to understand. The Emperor's vision of a humanity freed from warp travel seemed tantalizingly close, yet the path to that future led through territories that had been shaped by minds utterly alien to human thought. The data gathered from these early expeditions informed the next phase of the project's development. The Emperor began work on more sophisticated control systems that could impose human will upon the Webway's chaotic structure, forcing the alien pathways to conform to Imperial needs. The Golden Throne's capabilities were pushed to their limits as the Master of Mankind sought to extend his consciousness deeper into the dimensional maze, mapping routes that could support the movement of entire armies and establishing waypoints that could serve as staging areas for future expansion. The warning came not through conventional astropathic channels or the carefully regulated communication networks that bound the Imperium together, but as a psychic scream that tore through the Immaterium with the force of a stellar detonation. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, Legion and Master of Psychic Arts beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals, had witnessed the corruption of his brother Horus and the terrible truth of the War Master's fall to chaos. The urgency of his discovery demanded immediate action, yet the means by which he chose to deliver his warning would prove more catastrophic than the treachery he sought to expose. The Edict of Nicaea had been clear in its prohibition. The Emperor himself had decreed that the legions would abandon their librarious programs, that psychers within the Astartes would suppress their abilities, and that the dangerous pursuit of sorcerous knowledge would cease. The Council of Nicaea had heard testimony from both advocates and detractors of psychic warfare, with Magnus himself serving as the primary defender of the librarious tradition. When the Emperor rendered his final judgment, declaring that the risks outweighed the benefits and that humanity's future lay in freedom from such dependencies, Magnus had accepted the decision with apparent grace. Yet the Primarch of Prospero had never truly abandoned his studies. Deep within the crystal pyramids of his homeworld, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 civilizations, Magnus continued his exploration of the great ocean's mysteries. His understanding of psychic phenomena surpassed that of virtually every other being in the galaxy save for the Emperor himself. Where other psychers saw only raw power to be channeled, Magnus perceived the underlying mathematical structures that governed psychic energy, the dimensional frameworks that allowed consciousness to impose its will upon reality. The discovery of Horus's corruption came through Magnus's far sight, his ability to perceive distant events through psychic projection across the Immaterium. The visions that reached him on Prospero showed scenes of impossible horror. His beloved brother, the War Master who had stood at the Emperor's right hand since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, bowing before entities of pure malevolence. The Chaos Gods had claimed Horus Lupercal, twisting his noble purpose into something monstrous and filling his mind with lies about the Emperor's true intentions. Magnus understood immediately that conventional communication would be inadequate to convey both the urgency and the credibility of his warning. Astropathic messages could take months to traverse the galaxy, and even then might be dismissed as the ravings of a psyker driven mad by warp exposure. The bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium moved with deliberate caution, requiring verification and confirmation at every level before critical intelligence could reach the Emperor's attention. By the time such procedures were completed, Horus's rebellion might already be underway. The Crimson King made his choice with the absolute certainty that characterized all his decisions. He would project his consciousness directly to Terra, piercing the veils between dimensions to deliver his warning in person. The psychic energies required for such a feat would be enormous, demanding that he draw upon power sources that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Magnus began his preparations in the deepest chambers of his pyramid fortress, where ancient focusing crystals hummed with accumulated psychic resonance. The ritual chamber had been constructed according to principles that predated human civilization, its geometry designed to channel and amplify psychic energy with maximum efficiency. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls at precise angles, their faceted surfaces reflecting and refracting psychic emanations until they formed standing wave patterns of incredible complexity. The floor bore inscriptions in languages that existed only in the Imperium, their meanings shifting according to the mental state of those who read them. Magnus positioned himself at the chamber's focal point, his massive form dwarfing the human-scale proportions of the ancient architecture. The Primarch's physical presence radiated psychic energy even in his resting state, causing the air around him to shimmer with barely visible distortions. His single eye, the result of a bargain struck in his youth with entities he had believed benevolent, blazed with inner fire as he began to gather the power necessary for his desperate gambit. The initial phases of the projection proceeded according to Magnus's calculations. His consciousness separated from his physical form, rising through the layers of reality until it entered the roiling chaos of the great ocean. Here, in the realm where thought became substance and will imposed itself upon the fundamental forces of existence, Magnus began his journey toward Terra. The distance between Prospero and humanity's birthworld meant nothing in the Imperium, where proximity was determined by psychic resonance rather than physical separation. Yet as Magnus pressed deeper into the warp, seeking the psychic beacon that was the Emperor's presence, he encountered barriers that had not existed during his previous explorations. The approaches to Terra were warded with protections of incredible sophistication, layered defenses that turned aside even the most determined psychic intrusions. These were not the crude barriers employed by lesser psychers, but works of art that demonstrated mastery of dimensional manipulation beyond anything Magnus had previously witnessed. The Emperor's psychic shields around Terra formed a complex matrix of interlocking energy fields, each layer designed to counter specific forms of immaterial assault. The outermost barriers deflected casual psychic observation, ensuring that the planet's strategic importance remained hidden from the hungry gaze of chaos entities. Deeper layers filtered and analyzed incoming psychic communications, sorting legitimate astropathic traffic from potential contamination. At the core lay protections so sophisticated that they seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, creating zones where the laws of psychic interaction followed rules that even Magnus found difficult to comprehend. The Crimson King's initial attempts to breach these defenses met with complete failure. His psychic probes were turned aside or absorbed by the Emperor's wards, dissipating harmlessly against barriers that seemed to anticipate and counter every approach he attempted. Magnus realized that subtle infiltration would be impossible. The Emperor's defenses were too comprehensive and too well designed to permit conventional psychic penetration. Desperation drove Magnus to increasingly reckless measures. The urgency of his message about Horus's corruption overwhelmed his usual caution, pushing him to employ techniques that he would normally have approached with far greater care. He began drawing power not just from his own psychic reserves, but from the fundamental forces that sustained Prospero itself. The planet's crystalline formations, accumulated psychic energy from millennia of scholarly research, and even the life force of his own legion became fuel for his desperate assault on the Emperor's barriers. The psychic energies Magnus channeled grew beyond anything he had previously attempted to control. Power flowed through him in torrents that threatened to burn out his consciousness entirely, yet still the Emperor's defenses held firm. The barriers around Terra seemed to strengthen in response to each assault, adapting their configurations to counter Magnus's increasingly desperate attempts at penetration. What had begun as a carefully planned psychic projection was rapidly becoming a battle of wills between father and son. Magnus made his final, fatal decision with the absolute conviction that the stakes justified any risk. He would not merely attempt to breach the Emperor's defenses through superior power or cunning technique. Instead, he would shatter them entirely, using brute force to tear a hole through the psychic barriers that protected Terra. The Primarch gathered every scrap of power at his disposal, drawing energy from sources that existed at the very boundaries of safe psychic practice. The assault that followed was less a psychic projection than a controlled detonation of pure will made manifest. Magnus hurled himself against the Emperor's defenses with the force of a collapsing star, his consciousness compressed into a spear of psychic energy that burned with the intensity of a stellar core. The barriers around Terra, masterworks of psychic engineering that had taken the Emperor millennia to construct, held for mere seconds before the sheer magnitude of Magnus's assault overwhelmed their capacity to absorb and redirect incoming energy. The breach that resulted was not the clean penetration Magnus had intended, but a ragged tear that spread through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The Emperor's carefully constructed defenses collapsed in a cascade failure that sent shockwaves through both real space and the Imperium. Where once there had been elegant barriers that filtered and controlled psychic interaction, there was now a gaping wound that connected Terra directly to the chaotic energies of the warp. But Magnus's psychic spear had not merely penetrated the Emperor's defenses around Terra. In his desperation to reach his father, the Crimson King had struck at the very foundations of the Imperial Webway project. The dimensional barriers that separated the ancient Eldar tunnel network from the predations of chaos entities were far more delicate than the psychic shields protecting Terra's surface. Where the Emperor's defenses had been designed to withstand assault, the Webway's protections relied on subtlety and concealment to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The psychic shockwave from Magnus's breach tore through the Webway's dimensional matrix like a blade through silk. Ancient Wraithbone constructs, their crystalline structures attuned to maintain stable barriers between dimensions, cracked and shattered under the impact. The carefully maintained separation between the tunnel network and the Imperium collapsed across vast sections of the Imperial Webway, creating wounds in reality that bled raw chaos directly into the pathways beneath Terra. The immediate aftermath of the breach was catastrophic beyond Magnus's worst nightmares. Demonic entities, drawn by the sudden influx of psychic energy and the scent of mortal terror, poured through the dimensional tiers in numbers that defied counting. Lesser demons manifested first, their forms coalescing from the raw stuff of nightmare as they sought to establish footholds in the material realm. These were followed by greater entities, beings of such malevolence and power that their mere presence began to corrupt the Webway's crystalline structure. The tunnels that had once offered safe passage through dimensions became hunting grounds for predators that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Demonic hordes swept through the pathways, their alien geometries providing no obstacle to entities that moved according to the logic of dreams and madness. The ancient Eldar constructs that dotted the tunnel network became strongholds for chaos forces, their wraithbone walls twisted into configurations that hurt to perceive and served purposes that violated the fundamental laws of physics. The psychic resonance of the breach created feedback loops that amplified the dimensional instability across vast distances. Sections of the Webway that lay far from the initial point of failure began experiencing their own cascade collapses as the network's interconnected nature spread the damage throughout the system. What had begun as a localized breach became a spreading infection that threatened to consume the entire Imperial Webway project. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne's warning system screamed alerts that had never been designed to sound. The Emperor, his consciousness partially extended into the Webway's dimensional matrix through the throne's psychic amplification systems, felt the breach as a physical wound that tore through his very being. The carefully maintained balance between his role as master of the Great Crusade and guardian of the Webway project collapsed in an instant, forcing him to make a choice that would reshape the future of human civilization. The master of mankind's response was immediate and absolute. Every scrap of his attention turned toward the catastrophic breach, his consciousness flooding into the Webway to stem the tide of demonic incursion before it could spread beyond the tunnel network into Terra itself. The psychic shields that had protected the planet's surface were hastily reconfigured to contain rather than repel, creating a prison that trapped the chaos entities within the Webway's confines while simultaneously preventing their escape into real space. The effort required to maintain these containment barriers demanded the Emperor's constant, undivided attention. The Great Crusade, humanity's expansion across the galaxy, the reunification of the scattered Primarchs, all of these grand projects became secondary concerns compared to the immediate necessity of preventing demonic invasion of Terra. The Emperor's physical form became bound to the Golden Throne, his consciousness locked in eternal vigilance against the entities that prowled the tunnels beneath his palace. The irony of Magnus's folly was complete. In his desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption and save the Imperium from civil war, the Crimson King had crippled humanity's greatest hope for transcending its dependence on warp travel. The Imperial Webway, which might have freed mankind from the predations of chaos, had become a highway for demonic invasion that required the Emperor's eternal vigilance to contain. The warning about Horus reached its intended target, but the cost of delivering it had already doomed the Imperium to the very fate Magnus had sought to prevent. The breach in the Webway transformed the ancient Eldar tunnels from humanity's greatest hope into its most immediate existential threat. As demonic entities poured through the dimensional tiers in numbers that strained comprehension, the Emperor faced a crisis that demanded immediate military response. The conventional forces of the Imperial Army would have been worse than useless in the alien environment of the Webway, their minds unprepared for the reality-defying horrors that now stalked the crystalline passages. Only one force possessed the necessary combination of martial prowess, psychic resistance, and unwavering loyalty to stand against the demonic tide: the Adeptus Custodians. The 10,000 had been created for precisely such impossible circumstances. Each custodian represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic artistry, their enhanced physiology incorporating improvements that went far beyond the modifications granted to the Space Marines. Where the Astartes had been designed as mass-produced warriors capable of conquering human worlds, the Custodians were individually crafted masterpieces, each one a unique expression of the Emperor's vision for transcendent humanity. Their minds had been hardened against psychic intrusion through processes that bordered on the mystical, their souls wrapped in layers of protection that made them nearly invisible to demonic perception. The transition from palace guardians to tunnel fighters required rapid adaptation of tactics and equipment that had been refined over centuries of protecting the Emperor's person. The Custodians had trained extensively in close-quarters combat within the labyrinthine passages of the Imperial Palace, but the Webway presented challenges that no amount of preparation could fully address. The tunnels stretched in directions that violated conventional geometry, their crystalline walls pulsing with energies that caused standard equipment to malfunction and made traditional navigation impossible. Captain General Constantin Valdor led the initial deployment into the breach, his golden armor modified with additional psychic ward inscriptions and dimensional stabilizers that helped maintain equipment function in the Webway's chaotic environment. The Captain General's Guardian Spear had been reforged with archaeotech components recovered from the deepest vaults beneath the palace, its blade now wreathed in energy fields that could disrupt demonic cohesion on the molecular level. Behind him marched the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, their oromite armor gleaming despite the unnatural shadows that seemed to cling to every surface within the tunnels. The first engagement occurred within hours of the Custodians entering the breach. A pack of bloodletters, their brass-scaled forms still dripping with the ectoplasm of fresh manifestation, had established a position around one of the ancient Eldar Way stations. The demons moved with predatory grace through the tunnel's twisted geometry, their hellblades leaving trails of burning air as they sought to expand their foothold in the material realm. The Custodians advanced in perfect formation, their movements synchronized through decades of training together as a unified force. The battle that followed demonstrated both the Custodians' superiority as individual warriors and the unique challenges posed by demonic entities within the Webway's unstable environment. Valdor's guardian spear carved through the leading bloodletter with contemptuous ease, the demon's form dissolving into wisps of crimson smoke as the weapon's energy field disrupted its connection to the material plane. Yet even as the creature dissipated, the psychic resonance of its destruction sent ripples through the surrounding tunnel structure, causing sections of wraithbone wall to shift and flow like liquid. The Custodians found that their traditional tactics required constant modification to account for the Webway's fluid nature. Formations that worked perfectly in the palace corridors became death traps when the ground itself might suddenly tilt at impossible angles, or when walls could phase between solid and gaseous states without warning. The veterans of 1,000 battles learned to fight while maintaining constant awareness of their three-dimensional position, ready to adapt their stance as gravity shifted or as passages reconfigured themselves according to the chaotic influences bleeding through from the Imperium. Aquilus of the Shadowkeepers distinguished himself during the early campaigns by developing new fighting techniques specifically adapted to the Webway's unstable physics. The veteran Custodian observed that demonic entities retained certain behavioral patterns even when freed from the normal constraints of reality, and he began exploiting these predictable responses to create tactical advantages. His method of using the tunnel wall's psychoactive properties to redirect demon charges became standard practice among the Custodian squads, turning the environment's instability into a weapon against the invaders. The Shadowkeepers' innovations proved crucial during the defense of Junction Sigma 7, a critical nexus where multiple tunnel branches converged near the primary breach point. A horde of plaguebearers had seized control of the junction, their putrid forms spreading corruption through the crystalline matrix at an alarming rate. The demon's presence was causing the wraithbone structure to rot and decay, threatening to create additional dimensional instabilities that could allow even more entities to manifest. Aquilus led a strike force of 50 Custodians in a complex three-dimensional assault that used the junction's geometry against the defenders. The Shadowkeepers moved through passages that existed at angles impossible in normal space, emerging from directions that the Plaguebearers' limited perception could not anticipate. The attack succeeded in clearing the junction, but at a cost that highlighted the grinding nature of the war developing in the tunnels. 17 Custodians fell during the engagement, their enhanced physiology unable to fully protect them from the entropy effects generated by the Nurgle demon's death throes. Tribune Hedo Venator of the emissaries Imperatus pioneered the use of modified archaeotech weapons specifically designed to combat demonic entities in environments where reality itself was unstable. Working with tech priests who had volunteered for the dangerous duty of maintaining equipment within the Webway, Venator developed ammunition types that could maintain coherence even when fired through zones of dimensional flux. His conversion beamer had been recalibrated to project energy patterns that existed partially outside normal spacetime, allowing its destructive force to affect targets that had phased between material and immaterial states. The Tribune's tactical genius became evident during the month-long siege of the Crystal Spire, an ancient Eldar construct that had become a fortress for a warband of Tzeentch demons. The horrors occupying the structure could manipulate the spire's psychoactive architecture, reshaping corridors and chambers to confuse attackers and create killing fields filled with impossible angles. Venator's solution involved a systematic deconstruction of the building's dimensional anchors, using precisely targeted archaeotech weapons to sever the connections that allowed the structure to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The assault required unprecedented coordination between Custodian strike teams operating on different dimensional planes within the same physical space. Squads would advance through corridors that existed in parallel realities, their movements synchronized through psychic resonance rather than conventional communication. When the final anchor was severed, the crystal spire collapsed across multiple dimensions at once, crushing the demonic defenders and sealing off one of their primary strongholds. Yet the victory came at the cost of 38 custodians, including several veterans whose experience could never be replaced. The war's grinding attrition became apparent as the months stretched into years. The Custodians had been designed as an elite force capable of decisive action, not as a garrison army suited for prolonged defensive campaigns. Each fallen warrior represented not just the loss of an irreplaceable individual, but the erosion of institutional knowledge and tactical expertise that had been accumulated over centuries. The Emperor could not create new custodians quickly enough to replace the losses, and the surviving members of the 10,000 found themselves stretched increasingly thin across the expanding front lines. Shield Captain Diocles Cato of the Solar Watch developed the defensive doctrine that would define the Custodians' approach to the deepening crisis. Recognizing that the traditional aggressive tactics favored by the Custodians were unsustainable against endless waves of demonic reinforcements, Cato advocated for a strategy of controlled withdrawal, combined with the establishment of fortified strongpoints at critical junctions throughout the tunnel network. These positions would serve as both obstacles to demonic advance and staging areas for counterattacks when opportunities arose. The construction of these strongholds required extensive cooperation with tech priests and servitor work gangs who braved the Webway's dangers to install defensive systems. Automated gun turrets, their targeting systems modified to track entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime, were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire down major tunnel approaches. Psychic ward generators, powered by portable fusion reactors, created zones of relative stability where Custodian defenders could operate without constant concern for environmental hazards. The most ambitious of these installations was Bastion Aurum, a massive fortification built around the primary breach point, where Magnus's psychic assault had first torn through the dimensional barriers. The Bastion's design incorporated elements of both Imperial architecture and reverse-engineered Eldar construction techniques, creating a structure that could maintain stability even when subjected to the reality warping effects generated by major demonic incursions. Its walls were lined with Aurumite plating, inscribed with protective wards, while its weapon systems included some of the most advanced archaeotech devices ever deployed by Imperial forces. Yet even these elaborate defenses could only slow the demonic advance, not stop it entirely. The entities pouring through the breach possessed an alien cunning that allowed them to adapt to human tactics with disturbing speed. Bloodthirsters learned to approach the Custodian positions from angles that existed outside normal geometry, while Lords of Change used their mastery of temporal manipulation to attack fortifications before they had been fully constructed. The war became a contest between human engineering and demonic malevolence, with the stakes being nothing less than the survival of Terra itself. The psychological toll on the Custodians proved as significant as the physical casualties. Warriors who had spent their entire existence as the Emperor's companions now found themselves isolated in an alien realm, fighting an enemy that could corrupt reality itself through mere proximity. The tunnel environment played havoc with human perceptions, creating illusions and false memories that even the Custodians' enhanced minds struggled to resist. Veterans reported experiencing flashbacks to battles that had never occurred, or finding themselves unable to remember the faces of fallen comrades whose deaths they had personally witnessed. Apothecary Heliacs of the Shadowkeepers documented the unique medical challenges posed by extended combat within the Webway's unstable environment. Wounds inflicted by demonic weapons refused to heal properly, their edges remaining raw and infected, despite the Custodians' enhanced regenerative capabilities. Some injuries seem to exist partially outside normal space-time, causing phantom pain that persisted even after the physical damage had been repaired. Most disturbing were the cases of dimensional displacement, where portions of a warrior's body would phase slightly out of sync with the rest of their form, creating coordination problems that could prove fatal in combat. The apothecary's research revealed that prolonged exposure to the Webway's chaotic energies was causing subtle but cumulative changes to the Custodians' enhanced physiology. Their psychic resistance, normally absolute, showed signs of gradual erosion under constant exposure to demonic influences. Blood samples revealed cellular mutations that followed no pattern recognizable to Imperial medical science, while neural scans showed unusual activity in brain regions that should have remained dormant in post-human physiology. Tribune Ammon Toramation of the Dread Host emerged as one of the war's most effective field commanders through his development of mobile strike tactics that could exploit the Webway's fluid geometry. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions against superior numbers, Toramation's forces would appear suddenly at critical points, deliver devastating attacks, and then withdraw before the enemy could mount an effective response. His Custodians became masters of three-dimensional warfare, using the tunnel network's impossible architecture to approach targets from directions that existed outside normal space. The Tribune's greatest victory came during the Battle of the Writhing Gallery, where a massive force of Slaanesh demons had established a corruption nexus that was spreading hedonistic madness throughout an entire sector of the tunnel network. Toramation's strike force infiltrated the gallery through passages that existed in a state of temporal flux, allowing them to attack the demon host from multiple time streams simultaneously. The assault succeeded in destroying the corruption nexus, but the temporal distortions generated by the battle trapped several Custodian squads in recursive time loops from which they could never be extracted. As the war entered its third year, the signs of institutional exhaustion became impossible to ignore. The Custodian Guard, once numbering 10,000 strong, had been reduced to fewer than 7,000 effective fighters. Many of the survivors bore wounds that would never fully heal, while others showed signs of the psychological strain that came from fighting an enemy that violated every principle of rational warfare. The Emperor's companions had become prisoners in an alien realm, their golden armor tarnished by exposure to energies that existed beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. The tactical innovations developed by individual Custodians during the early phases of the war had evolved into a comprehensive doctrine for fighting in environments where normal physics held no sway. Yet these hard-won lessons came at a price, measured in the lives of warriors, whose value could never be calculated in conventional terms. Each fallen Custodian represented not just a tactical loss, but the death of a living artwork, a unique expression of the Emperor's vision for transcendent humanity that could never be replicated or replaced. The war in the Webway had become a grinding battle of attrition that the Custodians could not win through martial excellence alone. The demonic forces possessed an inexhaustible supply of reinforcements, while every human casualty brought the defenders closer to the point where their lines would finally break. The Golden Warriors, who had once stood as symbols of Imperial invincibility, now found themselves fighting a desperate holding action against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing day, their only hope being that somehow, somewhere, a solution might be found to seal the breach that had doomed them all to this eternal vigil. The arrival of the Sisters of Silence within the Webway marked a fundamental shift in the character of the war raging beneath Terra. Where the Custodian Guard had fought with martial excellence and enhanced physiology, the Anathema Templars brought something far more precious to the desperate battle: the complete absence of psychic presence that made them invisible to demonic perception and immune to the reality warping effects that had claimed so many Golden Warriors. Their null field abilities represented the perfect counter to entities that existed primarily as manifestations of psychic energy, turning the Sisters into living weapons specifically designed to combat the Immaterium's predators. The Silent Sisterhood's deployment required careful coordination with existing Custodian operations, as their null fields could interfere with the psychic ward systems that protected Imperial strongholds throughout the tunnel network. Sister Commander Janisha Kroll personally oversaw the integration protocols, working alongside Captain General Konstantin Valdor to develop tactical doctrines that maximize the Sisters' unique capabilities while minimizing disruption to established defensive positions. The process demanded extensive field testing, as the interaction between null fields and the Webway's psychoactive architecture produced effects that no amount of theoretical study could predict. The first joint operations revealed both the tremendous potential and unexpected complications of combining Custodian and Sister forces within the alien environment. A reconnaissance mission to the Crimson Nexus, a major junction that had fallen under demonic control during the early phases of the invasion, demonstrated the Sisters' ability to approach demon positions undetected. Squad Umbra, led by Sister Superior Tano Alaya, infiltrated the Nexus through passages that the defending Bloodletters could not perceive, their null presence creating blind spots in the demon's supernatural awareness. The engagement that followed showcased the devastating effectiveness of coordinated null field tactics against demonic entities. As the Sisters advanced through the Nexus, their psychic absence created zones of reality where the laws of physics reasserted themselves with brutal finality. Demons that had been phasing between dimensions found themselves suddenly locked into material form, vulnerable to conventional weapons in ways they had never experienced. The Bloodletters' Hellblades, which had carved through Auramite armor by existing partially outside normal spacetime, became simple metal weapons when wielded within the Sisters' null fields. Yet the mission also revealed the complex challenges of operating null fields within the Webway's unstable environment. The tunnels themselves were psychoactive constructs that relied on dimensional manipulation to maintain their structural integrity. When Sister Umbra's null field intersected with a section of Wraithbone wall, the ancient Eldar material began to destabilize, its crystalline matrix losing coherence as the psychic energies that sustained it were negated. The resulting collapse trapped 3 Custodians in a section of tunnel that briefly ceased to exist, their enhanced physiology barely sufficient to survive the experience of existing in a void between dimensions. Sister Commander Kroll adapted her deployment strategies based on these early lessons, developing protocols that minimized direct interaction between null fields and the Webway's structural elements, while maximizing their effectiveness against demonic targets. The Sisters learned to modulate their psychic absence, creating focused zones of negation that could be directed at specific targets without affecting the surrounding environment. This technique required extraordinary mental discipline, as the Sisters had to maintain conscious control over abilities that normally operated as passive effects of their enhanced physiology. The development of combined arms tactics between Custodians and Sisters produced some of the war's most successful operations. The Battle of the Shattered Prism exemplified this cooperation, as Tribune Hedo Venator's emissaries Imperatus worked alongside Sister Superior Thessaly Norder's Vigilabrante to assault a Tzeentch stronghold that had resisted conventional attacks for months. The demon fortress existed in a state of constant dimensional flux, its architecture shifting between multiple realities to confuse attackers and create impossible defensive positions. The assault began with the Sisters advancing through the fortress's outer defenses, their null fields disrupting the psychic mechanisms that allowed the structure to phase between dimensions. As the building's reality became fixed, the Custodians launched their attack through passages that had previously been inaccessible. The coordination required split-second timing, as the Sisters had to maintain their null fields at precisely the right intensity to stabilize the fortress, without causing structural collapse that might trap the advancing Custodians. Tribune Venator's modified conversion beamer proved devastatingly effective when fired through zones of null field stabilization. The weapon's energy patterns, normally dispersed by the fortress's dimensional instability, maintained coherence and focus when passing through areas where the Sisters had imposed normal physics. The resulting destruction carved through the demon stronghold's defenses like a blade through parchment, creating breaches that allowed the Custodians to penetrate deep into the structure's core. The battle's climax came when Sister Superior Norder led her squad directly into the fortress's central chamber, where a Lord of Change had established a corruption nexus that was spreading Tzeentchian influence throughout the surrounding tunnel network. The Greater Demon's presence warped reality to such an extent that the chamber existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, making conventional assault impossible. Norder's null field collapsed the dimensional variance into a single reality, forcing the Lord of Change into material form, where it could be engaged by conventional weapons. The demon's death throes generated psychic shockwaves that would have devastated any normal human force, but the sister's null fields absorbed and negated the energy discharge before it could manifest as reality-warping effects. The fortress collapsed in a cascade of crystalline debris as its psychic foundations were severed, but the combined Imperial force had achieved complete victory with minimal casualties. The success demonstrated the potential for null field tactics to turn the war's tide, but it also highlighted the enormous risks involved in deploying the Sisters within the Webway's unstable environment. The psychological impact of the war on the Silent Sisterhood proved more complex than the straightforward trauma experienced by other Imperial forces. The Sisters' null nature provided protection against the madness-inducing effects of prolonged demon exposure, but it also isolated them from the psychic resonance that connected other humans to their shared humanity. Within the Webway's alien environment, surrounded by entities that existed primarily as psychic phenomena, the Sisters found themselves experiencing a form of existential isolation that had no precedent in Imperial military experience. Sister Amendora Kendall of the Raptor Guard documented the unique challenges faced by the Sisterhood during extended deployments within the tunnel network. The constant presence of demonic entities, combined with the psychoactive nature of the Webway itself, created an environment where the Sisters' null fields were under continuous stress. Prolonged exposure to such conditions began producing physical symptoms that Imperial medical science struggled to understand or treat. Some Sisters reported experiencing phantom sensations in areas of their bodies that corresponded to psychic centers in normal humans. Others found their null fields fluctuating in intensity without conscious control, creating dangerous situations where their psychic absence might suddenly intensify or diminish during critical moments. Most disturbing were the cases where Sisters began manifesting what could only be described as negative psychic phenomena, creating zones where not just psychic energy, but certain forms of conventional energy ceased to function entirely. The medical implications of these developments concerned both the Sisterhood's leadership and the broader Imperial command structure. Sister Commander Kroll authorized extensive research into the long-term effects of null field exposure within psychically active environments, working with apothecary Heliacs and other medical specialists to understand the changes occurring within her warriors. The studies revealed that the Sisters' enhanced physiology was adapting to the Webway environment in ways that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered human. Despite these challenges, the Sisters of Silence proved instrumental in several critical engagements that prevented complete Imperial collapse within the tunnel network. The defense of Gate Tertius became legendary within both the Custodian Guard and the Silent Sisterhood as an example of perfect tactical coordination between the two forces. A massive Cornate assault, led by 3 Bloodthirsters and supported by countless lesser demons, had broken through the outer defensive lines and threatened to reach the primary breach point where the Emperor maintained his psychic vigil. Sister Superior Elia's prosecution force Umbra took position at the gate's choke point, their null fields creating a zone where the approaching demons would be forced into purely material form. The Bloodthirsters, accustomed to existing partially outside normal spacetime, found themselves suddenly subject to conventional physics as they entered the Sisters' area of influence. Their supernatural speed and strength remained formidable, but they could no longer phase through solid matter or regenerate damage through direct connection to the Imperium. The Custodian defenders, led by Shield Captain Diocles Cato, coordinated their fire with the Sisters' positioning to create overlapping kill zones that maximized the effectiveness of both forces. Guardian spears and bolt weapons found their targets with unprecedented accuracy, as the demons were locked into predictable movement patterns by the null fields. The battle raged for 18 hours, with the sisters maintaining their psychic negation despite exhaustion that pushed several warriors beyond their normal limits. The engagement's turning point came when Sister Alaya made the decision to extend her null field to maximum intensity, creating a zone of absolute psychic negation that encompassed the entire gate complex. The effort required her to draw upon reserves of will and determination that threatened to burn out her enhanced nervous system entirely, but the effect on the demon assault was immediate and decisive. The Bloodthirsters, suddenly cut off from their connection to Khorne's realm, began to destabilize at the molecular level as their forms lost coherence. The victory at Gate Tertius established protocols for null field deployment that would be used throughout the remainder of the war. The sisters learned to operate in coordinated groups that could maintain overlapping fields of psychic negation while supporting each other through the physical and mental strain of extended operations. These tactics required unprecedented cooperation and trust between warriors who had traditionally operated in isolation, but the results justified the adaptation. The war's progression revealed that certain types of demonic entities proved more vulnerable to null field effects than others. Tzeentch demons, whose existence depended heavily on psychic manipulation and reality warping abilities, found themselves almost helpless when confronted by the sisters' psychic absence. Slaanesh entities, which fed on emotional and sensory stimulation, experienced a form of starvation when exposed to null fields that negated the psychic resonance of their victims' suffering. Khorne demons proved more resilient, as their connection to violence and bloodshed operated through mechanisms that existed partially outside pure psychic phenomena. However, even Bloodletters and Bloodthirsters found their supernatural abilities significantly diminished when fighting within null field zones. Nurgle entities presented the greatest challenge, as their corruption operated through both psychic and biological vectors that could not be entirely negated through psychic absence alone. The sisters' tactical innovations extended beyond simple null field deployment to include specialized equipment and techniques designed specifically for Webway combat. Sister Artificer Corla Mensa developed modified execution blades that incorporated null field generators directly into their molecular structure, creating weapons that could disrupt demonic cohesion on contact while maintaining their effectiveness in environments where conventional null fields might interfere with the surrounding architecture. These enhanced weapons proved particularly effective during the cleansing of the Obsidian Labyrinth, a complex of tunnels that had become infested with Nurgle demons whose corruption was spreading through the Webway's crystalline matrix at an alarming rate. The standard approach of using null fields to negate demonic abilities risked destabilizing the tunnels themselves, potentially creating additional breaches that would allow more entities to manifest. Sister Superior Melpomene's Raptor Guard employed the modified execution blades to conduct surgical strikes against key corruption nodes within the labyrinth. The weapons integrated null fields operated at frequencies specifically tuned to disrupt demonic essence without affecting the surrounding Wraithbone structure. The campaign required months of careful infiltration and targeted elimination, but ultimately succeeded in purging the infestation without causing additional dimensional instabilities. The psychological toll on the sisters manifested in ways that differed significantly from the trauma experienced by other Imperial forces. Rather than the madness and corruption that threatened psychers and normal humans, the sisters faced a gradual erosion of their connection to baseline humanity. Extended exposure to the Webway's alien environment, combined with the constant stress of maintaining null fields under combat conditions, began producing changes in their neural patterns that concerned medical specialists. Some sisters reported experiencing synesthesia effects where they could perceive psychic phenomena as physical sensations despite their null nature. Others found their emotional responses becoming increasingly muted, as if their psychic absence was expanding to encompass aspects of consciousness that had previously remained unaffected. Most troubling were the cases where sisters began exhibiting what could only be described as negative empathy, creating zones where not just psychic connection, but basic human emotional resonance ceased to function. The war's grinding nature meant that the Sisters of Silence found themselves committed to a conflict that had no clear endpoint or victory conditions. Unlike the Great Crusades campaigns, which offered the promise of conquest and expansion, the Webway War was purely defensive in nature. The Sisters fought not to gain territory or achieve strategic objectives, but simply to prevent the complete collapse of Imperial defenses and the subsequent demonic invasion of Terra itself. This reality created unique challenges for maintaining morale and unit cohesion within the Silent Sisterhood. The warriors who had once served as the Emperor's personal executioners, traveling across the galaxy to eliminate rogue psykers and other threats, now found themselves trapped in an underground war against enemies that could not be permanently defeated. Each victory was temporary, each cleared tunnel could be reinfested within days, and the overall strategic situation continued to deteriorate despite their best efforts. The adaptation of Silent Sister tactics to Webway conditions required fundamental changes to their traditional operational methods. The Sisterhood had historically operated in small groups or as individuals, using their null fields to isolate and eliminate specific targets. The Demon War demanded larger formations capable of maintaining coordinated null field zones while supporting conventional military operations alongside the Custodian Guard. Sister Commander Kroll reorganized the Sisterhood's command structure to accommodate these new requirements, creating specialized formations that combine the Sisters' traditional skills with the tactical flexibility needed for tunnel warfare. The prosecution forces were expanded and given additional support personnel, while new units like the Null Maidens were established specifically for extended deployment within the Webway's hostile environment. The war had transformed the Silent Sisterhood from an elite force of specialized executioners into a crucial component of Terra's defense, their unique abilities proving essential for humanity's survival in the face of demonic invasion. Yet this transformation came at a cost that would only become apparent in the years that followed, as the Sisters who emerged from the Webway bore changes that would affect not just their own futures, but the entire trajectory of the Silent Sisterhood's role within the Imperium. The deployment of Titan legions into the Webway represented one of the most audacious military adaptations in Imperial history, born from desperate necessity, as the Demon incursion continued to expand beyond the containment capabilities of infantry forces alone. The ancient war engines of the Adeptus Mechanicus had been designed to stride across planetary battlefields, their colossal forms dominating open terrain through superior firepower and armored resilience. The confined passages of the Eldar Tunnel network presented challenges that no princeps had ever imagined facing, requiring fundamental modifications to both tactical doctrine and the god machines themselves. The first attempts to deploy Titans within the Webway met with immediate complications that threatened to end the experiment before it could properly begin. The Warhound-class scouts of Legio Ignatum discovered that their standard void shield generators created dangerous resonance effects when activated within the psychoactive environment of the tunnels. The shield's energy fields interfered with the wraithbone matrix that formed the passage walls, causing structural instabilities that could collapse entire sections of tunnel onto the advancing war engines. Tech priests worked frantically to recalibrate the shield systems, developing new harmonics that could provide protection without disrupting the alien architecture. Princeps Majoris Kelber personally oversaw the modifications required to make Titan deployment feasible within the Webway's constraints. The Fabricator General's own Imperator-class Titan, Omnissiah's Will, became the testbed for experimental systems designed to operate in environments where conventional physics held only tenuous authority. The massive war engine's plasma reactor required extensive shielding to prevent its fusion processes from creating dimensional tears in the surrounding tunnel structure, while its weapon systems needed recalibration to function effectively in spaces where energy dispersal followed rules that defied standard ballistic calculations. The breakthrough came when Magos Dominus Lucas Chrome of the Legio Mortis discovered that certain archaeotech components recovered from the deepest vaults beneath Mars could interface directly with the Webway's psychoactive materials. These ancient devices, their origins lost to the Age of Strife, seemed designed to operate in environments where thought and reality intersected. When integrated into Titan command systems, they allowed Princeps to maintain direct neural control over their war engines, even when surrounded by the reality warping effects generated by major demon incursions. The modified Titans that eventually entered the Webway bore little resemblance to their standard configurations. Void shields had been replaced with experimental field generators that created zones of stabilized reality around the war engines, allowing them to function as mobile bastions of Imperial order within the chaotic tunnel network. Weapon loadouts emphasized directed energy systems over ballistic weapons, as plasma cannons and laser destructors proved more reliable than shell-firing guns in an environment where projectile trajectories could be altered by localized distortions in space-time. Legio Mortis distinguished itself during the early phases of Titan deployment through the development of formation tactics specifically adapted to tunnel warfare. The Death's Heads learned to advance in single-file columns that maximized their firepower while minimizing their vulnerability to tunnel collapses or dimensional anomalies. Their Warhound scouts would advance ahead of the main force, using modified Auspex systems to detect demon concentrations and identify stable passages capable of supporting the weight of larger war engines. The Battle of the Brass Citadel demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Titan warfare within the Webway's confines. A massive Cornate fortress had materialized at a critical junction, its brass walls and spiked towers extending through multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The structure served as a staging area for demon assaults against Imperial positions throughout the sector, and conventional forces had proven incapable of breaching its defenses. Princeps Seniorus Mordian Kryn led a battle group of 6 Warlord-class Titans in a direct assault on the Citadel's primary gates. The approach to the fortress required the Titans to navigate through passages barely wide enough to accommodate their massive forms. The war engines advanced in single file, their void shields scraping against the tunnel walls as they squeezed through openings that had never been intended for vehicles of such enormous size. The lead Titan, Daiseri of the Legio Mortis, suffered extensive armor damage as crystalline protrusions tore gouges through its adamantium plating, but the war engine pressed forward with the inexorable determination that characterized all god machines. The assault itself showcased the devastating firepower that Titans could bring to bear even in confined spaces. Volcano cannons carved through the Citadel's brass walls with contemptuous ease, their fusion beams maintaining coherence despite the dimensional distortions surrounding the fortress. Turbo laser destructors swept demon defenders from the battlements in sheets of coherent energy, while plasma cannons reduced entire sections of the structure to molten slag. The concentrated firepower of 6 Warlord Titans proved capable of reducing even a major demon stronghold to rubble within hours. Yet the victory came at a cost that highlighted the unique vulnerabilities of Titan operations within the Webway. The Citadel's destruction generated psychic shockwaves that propagated through the tunnel network, causing reality storms that damaged the war engine's more sensitive systems. 2 Titans suffered complete neural interface failures as their Princeps were overwhelmed by the psychic backlash, leaving the massive war engines temporarily paralyzed until backup crew could assume control. The Daiseri itself was forced to withdraw after its plasma reactor began showing signs of dimensional displacement, threatening a catastrophic breach that could have destroyed the entire battle group. The logistical challenges of maintaining Titan legions within the Webway proved even more daunting than the tactical adaptations required for combat operations. The god machines required enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to remain operational, yet the tunnel network's isolation from traditional supply lines made conventional resupply impossible. Forged ships could not navigate the Webway's passages, and even smaller transport vessels found their systems disrupted by the psychoactive environment that surrounded them. Magos Dominus Urtzi Malevolus of the Legio Tempestus pioneered the development of mobile forged shrines capable of operating within the tunnel network's hostile environment. These heavily modified vehicles combined manufacturing capabilities with the defensive systems necessary to survive demon attacks, creating mobile bases that could produce ammunition and spare parts for the war engines they supported. The forged shrines operated using archaeotech fabrication systems that could function despite the dimensional instabilities that plagued conventional manufacturing equipment. The most successful of these installations was Forged Shrine Adamant, a massive tracked vehicle that served as the primary support facility for Titan operations in the Crimson Sector. The shrine's hull incorporated wraithbone elements scavenged from destroyed Eldar constructs, allowing it to interface directly with the tunnel network's psychoactive architecture. Its manufacturing bays could produce everything from bolt shells to plasma coils, while its repair facilities were equipped with servo arms and mechanical appendages capable of performing maintenance on even the largest war engines. Yet even these innovations could not fully solve the supply crisis facing the Titan legions. The war engines consumed resources at rates that exceeded the Forged Shrine's production capacity, forcing princeps to carefully ration ammunition and prioritize targets based on strategic importance rather than tactical opportunity. Plasma reactors that normally operated at optimal efficiency were forced to run at reduced power levels to extend fuel supplies, while weapon systems that required exotic materials were gradually retired as irreplaceable components wore out. The psychological toll on Titan crews proved as significant as the mechanical challenges they faced. Princeps who had spent their entire careers commanding god machines across planetary battlefields found themselves confined to tunnels that offered no horizon, no sky, and no sense of the vast spaces that Titans were designed to dominate. The neural interface systems that connected crew to machine began experiencing interference from the Webway's psychoactive environment, creating feedback loops that could drive operators to madness or leave them permanently fused with their war engine's machine spirits. Princeps Maximus Esau Turnit of the Legio Graphonicus documented the unique medical challenges facing Titan crews during extended Webway deployments. The confined spaces within the tunnels created claustrophobic conditions that proved particularly difficult for individuals accustomed to commanding war engines across open terrain. Many crew members reported experiencing phantom sensations of movement and space that their current environment could not provide, leading to disorientation and loss of situational awareness during critical combat situations. The machine spirits of the Titans themselves seemed to react poorly to the alien environment of the Webway. War engines that had operated flawlessly for centuries began exhibiting behavioral anomalies that tech priests struggled to understand or correct. Some Titans became increasingly aggressive, their machine spirits apparently influenced by the violent energies that permeated the tunnel network. Others grew sluggish and unresponsive, as if the psychoactive environment was dampening their artificial consciousness. The Warlord-class Titan Canis Vertex of the Legio Astorum experienced the most dramatic example of machine spirit corruption during the siege of the Screaming Gallery. The war engine's plasma reactor began operating at frequencies that resonated with the demon-infested tunnel structure, creating harmonic effects that amplified both the Titan's firepower and its vulnerability to psychic attack. The machine spirit's personality matrix became increasingly erratic, exhibiting behaviors that suggested it was attempting to communicate with the demonic entities inhabiting the surrounding passages. Night houses proved more adaptable to Webway conditions than their larger Titan cousins, their smaller size and more agile frames allowing them to navigate passages that would have been impassable for god machines. House Raven distinguished itself through the development of tunnel fighting techniques that emphasized mobility and precision over raw firepower. Their Knight Paladins learned to use the confined spaces to their advantage, employing hit-and-run tactics that prevented demon forces from bringing their superior numbers to bear effectively. The Knights' thermal cannons proved particularly effective against demonic entities, as the focused heat beams could disrupt demon cohesion without generating the dimensional instabilities associated with more exotic weapon systems. Battle cannons required modification to prevent their explosive shells from causing tunnel collapses, but when properly configured, they could clear entire passages of lesser demon swarms with single shots. The Knights' close combat weapons needed no modification, as chainswords and power fists remained devastatingly effective against demonic flesh regardless of the environment. House Cadmus developed specialized formations that combined Knight Lances with Custodian Guard units, creating combined arms forces that could exploit the strengths of both Imperial war machines and enhanced human warriors. The Knights provided heavy firepower and mobile cover, while the Custodians offered precision targeting and the tactical flexibility necessary for operations in the Webway's constantly changing environment. These formations proved particularly effective during clearing operations in sectors that had been abandoned to demon control for extended periods. The maintenance requirements for Knight suits operating within the Webway created unique challenges for their noble pilots and sacristan crews. The psychoactive environment caused accelerated wear on mechanical components, while exposure to demonic energies created forms of contamination that required specialized purification rituals to remove. House Terran's sacristans developed new maintenance protocols that incorporated elements of both Mechanicus doctrine and anti-demon procedures, creating hybrid techniques that could keep Knight suits operational despite the hostile environment. The war engine's ammunition requirements created bottlenecks that limited their effectiveness during extended engagements. Titan-grade shells and energy cells could not be manufactured within the Webway using conventional techniques, forcing commanders to carefully husband their firepower for critical moments. Some princeps resorted to using their war engines as mobile fortifications rather than active combatants, positioning their Titans at strategic choke points where their presence alone could deter demon advances without expending precious ammunition. The development of energy-based weapon systems helped alleviate some supply constraints, as plasma and laser weapons could operate using power drawn directly from Titan reactors rather than requiring manufactured ammunition. However, these systems generated heat signatures that attracted certain types of demon, particularly those aligned with Khorne, whose hunger for destruction was triggered by displays of raw firepower. The war engines found themselves caught between the practical necessity of conserving resources and the tactical requirement to maintain sufficient firepower to repel demon assaults. Tech priests assigned to Webway operations began developing hybrid technologies that incorporated elements of both Imperial and Eldar engineering principles. These experimental systems attempted to harness the psychoactive properties of Wraithbone to enhance Titan performance, creating weapon systems that could adapt their characteristics based on the mental state of their operators. The results were promising but unpredictable, with some systems exceeding all performance expectations, while others failed catastrophically when exposed to the emotional stress of combat. The most ambitious of these projects was the development of psycho-reactive armor plating that could alter its density and configuration in response to incoming threats. The armor incorporated microscopic wraithbone fibers that responded to the pilot's subconscious awareness of danger, automatically reinforcing sections that were about to receive damage while reducing protection in areas that faced no immediate threat. The system showed remarkable effectiveness during field trials, but its reliance on psychoactive materials made it vulnerable to demon influence in ways that conventional armor was not. The war engines deployed within the Webway gradually evolved into forms that bore little resemblance to their original configurations. Void shields were replaced with reality stabilizers. Weapons were modified to function in environments where physics operated according to alien rules, and armor was enhanced with materials that existed partially outside normal space-time. These modifications created war engines that were supremely adapted to tunnel warfare, but increasingly unsuitable for conventional planetary operations. The Titans and Knights fighting within the Webway had become specialized tools designed for a single, specific battlefield. Their crews developed skills and techniques that had no application outside the tunnel network, while their machine spirits adapted to an environment that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. The war engines had evolved into something new, neither fully imperial nor entirely alien, shaped by the necessities of a conflict that demanded constant adaptation to survive in a realm where the normal rules of warfare held no meaning. The breach in the Webway had torn open more than just a pathway between dimensions. It had created a wound in reality itself that bled the raw essence of chaos directly into the material realm. Through this gaping rent poured entities that embodied the fundamental forces of destruction, corruption, change, and excess that had plagued the galaxy since the birth of consciousness itself. The four great powers of chaos, locked in their eternal competition for supremacy within the Imperium, saw the breach as both opportunity and battlefield, each seeking to establish dominance over this unprecedented foothold in real space. The nature of the demonic incursion defied conventional military analysis, as the entities manifesting within the tunnels operated according to principles that existed entirely outside human understanding of warfare. These were not armies in any traditional sense, but rather expressions of pure concept given form, each demon representing a fragment of its patron deity's infinite malevolence. Cornate entities materialized as living embodiments of rage and bloodshed, their brass-scaled forms radiating heat that could melt wraithbone at close proximity. Nurgle's children brought with them the stench of decay and the promise of entropy, their putrid flesh weeping toxins that corroded the ancient Eldar, construct simply through proximity. The servants of Tzeentch arrived as impossibly complex geometric forms that hurt to perceive directly, their crystalline bodies refracting light in ways that created optical illusions capable of driving observers to madness. These entities wielded sorceries that could rewrite the fundamental laws governing local reality, turning solid walls into liquid mercury or transforming breathable atmosphere into clouds of acidic vapor. Their presence warped the Webway's already unstable architecture into configurations that violated basic principles of three-dimensional space, creating passages that led to their own beginnings or chambers that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Slaanesh's demonettes manifested with forms designed to appeal to the deepest desires and hidden lusts of any sentient observer, their appearances shifting constantly to present the most seductive possible configuration to whoever gazed upon them. Yet beneath their alluring exteriors lay claws sharp enough to part molecular bonds and voices that could shatter sanity through pure sonic manipulation. Their movements through the tunnels left traces of psychoactive substances that induced euphoric hallucinations in any human who breathed the contaminated air, creating zones where Imperial defenders might find themselves paralyzed by artificial bliss even as demon claws tore through their flesh. The greater demons leading these infernal hosts represented the pinnacle of their respective patrons' malevolence, each one a unique expression of divine wrath given autonomous existence. The first bloodthirster to manifest within the Webway emerged from the primary breach point, wreathed in flames that burned without consuming oxygen, its massive form standing nearly 4 meters tall, even in its hunched posture. The creature's brass armor had been forged in the heart of Khorne's realm, each plate inscribed with the names of 1,000,000 slain mortals whose blood had fed the blood god's eternal hunger. This particular bloodthirster, known to the few Imperial scholars who had encountered references to it as Angron's Bane, wielded a double-bladed axe whose edge existed in a state of constant molecular vibration. The weapon could cleave through Oromite armor as easily as parchment, while its psychic resonance generated feedback that caused physical pain to any psyker within several kilometers. The demon's tactical approach to the tunnel warfare reflected Khorne's preference for direct confrontation, as it led mass charges of bloodletters through the narrowest passages, using the confined spaces to prevent Imperial defenders from bringing their superior coordination to bear effectively. The Bloodthirsters' campaign focused on seizing control of the major junction points that connected different sectors of the tunnel network, recognizing that control of these strategic nodes would allow Khornate forces to dictate the flow of battle throughout the entire system. Its forces moved with surprising tactical sophistication, establishing forward positions that could channel Imperial counterattacks into killing zones where demon numbers could overwhelm even the enhanced capabilities of Custodian warriors. The creature's supernatural awareness of bloodshed allowed it to coordinate multiple simultaneous assaults across vast distances, appearing personally at any engagement where the scent of spilled blood grew strong enough to attract its attention. The Lord of Change that had claimed dominion over the eastern sectors of the tunnel network presented a far more subtle threat than its Khornate counterpart. This entity, whose true name existed as a mathematical equation that could not be spoken aloud without causing localized reality distortions, approached the war as an elaborate game of strategy spanning multiple dimensions and temporal streams. Its crystalline form stood 3 meters tall, with wings that cast shadows in colors that had no names in any human language. The demon's mastery of temporal manipulation allowed it to conduct battles across multiple timelines simultaneously, attacking Imperial positions before they had been established, while simultaneously defending against counterstrikes that had not yet been planned. Custodian forces found themselves fighting enemies who knew their tactics before they had been decided upon, facing demon formations that had adapted to counter strategies that existed only as theoretical possibilities in their commanders' minds. The Lord of Change's influence gradually spread throughout the tunnel network like a virus, infecting the very structure of causality until cause and effect became divorced from their normal relationship. This greater demon's campaign involved the systematic corruption of the Webway's navigational systems, using its sorcerous abilities to redirect passages so that Imperial forces would find themselves emerging from tunnels they had never entered, or arriving at destinations that existed in different time periods entirely. Entire Custodian squads vanished into temporal loops from which they could never escape, trapped in recursive cycles where they fought the same battle repeatedly without ever achieving resolution. The demon's ultimate objective appeared to be the complete transformation of the tunnel network into a maze where linear time held no meaning, creating a realm where only creatures capable of existing across multiple temporal states could function effectively. The Great Unclean One that had established its domain in the southern sectors represented perhaps the most insidious threat to the Webway's structural integrity. This mountainous entity, whose bloated form barely fit within even the largest tunnel passages, radiated corruption on a molecular level that transformed everything it touched into extensions of its own putrid flesh. The demon's presence accelerated entropy within the ancient Wraithbone constructs, causing millennia-old architecture to crumble into dust within hours of exposure to its influence. The creature's tactical approach emphasized patience and gradual expansion rather than direct confrontation, understanding that time itself was its greatest weapon. Its forces moved slowly through the tunnels, establishing corruption nodes that continued spreading Nurgle's influence even after the demon forces had moved on to new targets. These infected areas became breeding grounds for lesser demons and plague zombies, creating self-sustaining ecosystems of decay that required enormous Imperial resources to cleanse. The Great Unclean One's ultimate strategy appeared focused on transforming the entire Webway into a garden of corruption where only Nurgle's children could survive. The demon's most devastating weapon was its ability to corrupt the psychoactive properties of Wraithbone itself, turning the material that formed the tunnel walls into a substance that responded to thoughts of decay and despair rather than focused will and intention. Sections of the network under its influence began exhibiting behaviors reminiscent of diseased tissue, with passages contracting and expanding in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat, while weeping fluids that dissolved anything they touched. Imperial forces operating in these areas found their equipment corroding at accelerated rates, while their enhanced physiology struggled to resist infections that operated on both biological and spiritual levels. The Keeper of Secrets that had claimed the Western approaches to the breach represented the most psychologically dangerous of the greater demon commanders. This entity's form shifted constantly between masculine and feminine characteristics, its appearance designed to fulfill the deepest desires of whoever observed it, while simultaneously representing their darkest fears. The demon stood nearly 3 meters tall, its movements possessing a hypnotic grace that could entrance even the psychically resistant custodians if they observed it for extended periods. The creature's tactical doctrine focused on psychological warfare and the corruption of imperial morale rather than direct military confrontation. Its forces specialized in ambush tactics that isolated small groups of defenders, subjecting them to experiences designed to break their mental resistance and turn them into willing servants of Slaanesh. The demon's presence generated psychoactive fields that induced artificial emotions in nearby humans, flooding their consciousness with sensations of pleasure or pain so intense that rational thought became impossible. The Keeper of Secrets had established what could only be described as pleasure palaces within captured sections of the tunnel network, transforming ancient Eldar way stations into monuments to excess and depravity. These installations served both as recruitment centers for corrupted Imperial personnel and as staging areas for raids against uncontaminated sections of the Webway. The demon's ultimate objective appeared to be the complete psychological subversion of the human forces defending the tunnels, creating an army of willing servants who would open the way for Slaanesh's influence to spread throughout the galaxy. The competition between these greater demons created a complex web of alliances and conflicts that Imperial commanders struggled to understand or exploit. The Bloodthirster and Lord of Change maintained an uneasy cooperation based on their mutual recognition that Khorne and Tzeentch required each other's existence to maintain their own identity. Yet this alliance could dissolve into open warfare whenever their tactical objectives conflicted. The Great Unclean One pursued its own agenda with methodical patience, occasionally cooperating with other demon forces when such alliances served Nurgle's purposes, but remaining fundamentally focused on its long-term goal of universal entropy. The Keeper of Secrets played the most complex game, forming temporary alliances with each of the other greater demons, while simultaneously working to undermine their objectives through subtle manipulation and psychological warfare. The demon's ability to appear as whatever its targets most desired made it an invaluable diplomatic asset, yet its fundamental nature as an embodiment of excess meant that any alliance it formed would inevitably be betrayed when doing so would provide greater pleasure than maintaining loyalty. The presence of these 4 greater demons within the Webway began producing effects that extended far beyond their immediate military impact. The tunnel network's psychoactive architecture started responding to their combined influence, with different sectors taking on characteristics that reflected the nature of their demon occupiers. Areas under Khornate control became mazes of brass and blood-red crystal, their passages narrowing into choke points designed to maximize the carnage of any battle fought within them. The walls themselves began sprouting weapon-like protrusions that could impale unwary travelers, while the floor became covered in a substance that felt disturbingly similar to dried blood. Tzeentchian sectors transformed into impossible geometric puzzles, where passages led in directions that should not have existed, their walls covered in constantly shifting patterns that induced vertigo and disorientation in anyone who looked at them too closely. The very concept of distance became negotiable within these areas, with some corridors stretching for apparent kilometers, while others compressed space so severely that travelers could cross vast distances with single steps. Time flowed differently in each chamber, creating zones where seconds could stretch into subjective hours, or where entire battles might be compressed into moments too brief for conscious perception. The corruption spreading from Nurgle-controlled areas followed biological rather than architectural principles, transforming sterile crystalline passages into organic tunnels that pulsed with diseased life. The walls began secreting fluids that supported ecosystems of parasites and decay organisms, while the floor became covered in a carpet of fungal growth that released spores capable of causing hallucinations and respiratory failure in humans. These infected zones continued expanding even when no demon forces were present, spreading like cancer through the tunnel network's interconnected structure. Slaaneshi influence manifested as areas of impossible beauty and sensory overload, where the tunnel walls became mirrors that reflected not physical forms, but the deepest desires and fears of those who passed by them. The air in these sections carried psychoactive compounds that induced euphoric states, while simultaneously heightening pain sensitivity to levels that could cause shock from minor injuries. The architecture itself became seductive, with passages that seemed to beckon travelers toward hidden chambers where unspeakable pleasures and torments awaited. The strategic implications of demon forces potentially reaching other Webway gates throughout the galaxy created a crisis that extended far beyond Terra's immediate defense. The tunnel network connected to hundreds of worlds across human space, many of them critical industrial centers or strategic strongholds, whose loss would cripple the Great Crusade's ability to continue expansion. Intelligence reports suggested that some demon forces had already begun exploring the deeper reaches of the tunnel system, seeking pathways that would allow them to emerge on distant worlds where Imperial defenses were unprepared for such exotic threats. The Adeptus Mechanicus calculated that if demon forces succeeded in reaching even a dozen major Webway terminals, the resulting chaos would create a domino effect that could collapse Imperial control over entire sectors. Forge worlds connected to the network would face corruption of their manufacturing capabilities, while Hive worlds could experience demonic manifestations in their deepest levels, where billions of citizens would be trapped with no possibility of evacuation. The Webway, which had been intended as humanity's path to freedom from warp travel, threatened to become the very mechanism by which chaos achieved total victory over the material realm. The demon forces showed increasing sophistication in their exploration of the tunnel network's deeper reaches, with scouting parties probing passages that led to distant star systems, while larger formations established forward bases at critical junction points. The entities seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the Webway's structure that exceeded even Eldar knowledge, navigating passages that had been sealed for millennia and discovering routes that connected to worlds that had never appeared on any Imperial star chart. The demon reconnaissance forces that had begun probing the Webway's deeper passages represented only the advance guard of a threat that could potentially consume the entire galaxy. As reports filtered back through the tunnel network's compromised communication systems, the full scope of the crisis became apparent to the Emperor himself. His consciousness, already stretched between maintaining the psychic barriers that contained the breach and powering the Astronomican's guiding light for Imperial fleets scattered across the galaxy, now faced demands that pushed even his transcendent abilities toward their absolute limits. The Golden Throne had become both prison and command center, its ancient mechanisms humming with energies that threatened to overload systems designed during humanity's lost Golden Age. The Emperor's physical form, once a towering figure of impossible majesty whose mere presence could inspire absolute devotion in mortals, began showing signs of the enormous strain placed upon it by his dual responsibilities. The psychic effort required to maintain stable barriers around the breach, while simultaneously projecting his consciousness across the galaxy to guide Imperial vessels, created a metabolic burden that even his enhanced physiology struggled to sustain. Tech priests monitoring the throne's life support systems reported fluctuations in the Emperor's vital signs that would have killed any normal human instantly. His enhanced cardiovascular system operated at levels that pushed its biological limits, while neural activity readings showed patterns of brain function that exceeded the measurement capabilities of Imperial medical equipment. The master of mankind's body was consuming itself to fuel the psychic energies necessary to prevent Terra's complete destruction, yet he maintained his vigil with the absolute determination that had driven him to unite humanity under his rule. The psychic barriers containing the demon incursion required constant adjustment and reinforcement as the entities within the Webway tested their prison's limits with increasing sophistication. The greater demons commanding the invasion had begun coordinating their assaults on the containment fields, combining their disparate abilities to create focused attacks that strained the Emperor's defenses in ways that no single demon could achieve alone. The Bloodthirster's raw fury provided the destructive force, while the Lord of Change's temporal manipulations allowed the assault to occur across multiple time streams simultaneously. The Great Unclean One's corruption ate away at the barrier's structural integrity, while the Keeper of Secrets sought psychological vulnerabilities in the Emperor's, will that might create momentary lapses in concentration. Each coordinated assault forced the Emperor to divert additional psychic energy from the Astronomican's operation, creating brief periods where the beacon's light dimmed across the galaxy. Imperial fleets navigating the warp during these moments found themselves temporarily lost in the Imperium's chaotic currents, their navigators struggling to maintain course without the guiding light that had become as essential to space travel as the Geller fields protecting them from demonic intrusion. Some vessels emerged from warp translation days or weeks off their intended destinations, while others simply vanished entirely, their fates unknown but almost certainly grim. The Emperor's communications with his remaining loyal Primarchs became increasingly sporadic as more of his attention was consumed by the crisis beneath Terra. Rogel Dorn, who had been recalled to fortify the Imperial Palace against the coming storm of civil war, found himself receiving fragmented telepathic messages that conveyed strategic information in compressed bursts of pure thought. The Praetorian of Terra adapted his defensive preparations based on these brief communications, understanding that his father's ability to provide detailed guidance had become severely limited by the demands of containing the demon incursion. Sanguinius received similar fragmented communications while leading his blood angels in the outer reaches of the galaxy, the Emperor's messages arriving as sudden flashes of insight that provided crucial intelligence about Horus's movements and intentions. The angel's psychic sensitivity allowed him to perceive the enormous strain his father was enduring, sensing the gradual erosion of the Emperor's consciousness as it was stretched between multiple critical functions. These glimpses into his father's suffering filled Sanguinius with a profound sense of urgency, driving him to complete his current campaigns with unprecedented speed so that he might return to Terra before the crisis reached its inevitable climax. Leman Russ, operating in the galactic north with his space wolves, found that his communications with the Emperor had taken on an increasingly desperate quality. The Wolf King's missions against traitor forces required precise coordination with other loyal elements, yet the intelligence he received from Terra often arrived hours or days late, as the Emperor's attention was diverted by sudden surges in demon activity within the Webway. Russ began making tactical decisions based on incomplete information, trusting his instincts and the Emperor's earlier guidance to maintain the effectiveness of his operations despite the communication difficulties. The coordination of Terra's defense became increasingly complicated as the Emperor's direct involvement in strategic planning diminished. Malkador the Sigillite assumed greater responsibility for managing the Imperium's day-to-day operations, his own considerable psychic abilities allowing him to serve as an intermediary between the Emperor and his military commanders. Yet even the Regent's enhanced capabilities were insufficient to fully compensate for the Master of Mankind's reduced availability, creating gaps in command authority that threatened to undermine the efficiency of Imperial responses to the growing crisis. The physical deterioration of the Emperor's form accelerated as the months of constant vigilance took their toll. His enhanced metabolism, pushed beyond its designed limits by the enormous energy requirements of maintaining dual psychic projections, began consuming muscle tissue and other biological resources to fuel its continued operation. The golden radiance that had always surrounded his presence began to flicker and dim, while his physical movements became increasingly labored as cellular damage accumulated faster than his regenerative systems could repair it. Apothecary General Fabius, one of the few medical specialists authorized to monitor the Emperor's condition, directly documented changes that defied conventional understanding of human physiology. the master of mankind's cellular structure was undergoing transformations that seemed to blur the boundaries between biological and psychic existence, with some tissue samples exhibiting properties that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Blood tests revealed the presence of exotic particles that should not have been able to exist within a material matrix, while neural scans showed activity patterns that suggested consciousness operating across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The impossible choice facing the Emperor became increasingly stark as the demon forces within the Webway grew bolder in their attempts to break free from their containment. Abandoning the Webway project entirely would require him to collapse the tunnel network's connection to Terra, sealing the breach through a controlled implosion that would destroy centuries of work and eliminate humanity's best hope for transcending its dependence on warp travel. Yet maintaining the current situation demanded ever-increasing amounts of psychic energy that were literally consuming his physical form, creating a scenario where eventual failure seemed inevitable regardless of his determination to continue the vigil. The strategic calculations surrounding this dilemma occupied much of the Emperor's remaining cognitive capacity during brief respites between demon assaults on the containment barriers. Collapsing the Webway connection would eliminate the immediate threat to Terra, but would also strand any Imperial forces still operating within the tunnel network, condemning thousands of Custodians and Sisters of Silence to death or worse fates at the hands of demon forces. The political implications were equally severe, as the project's failure would validate the warnings of those who had opposed humanity's reliance on alien technology and psychic manipulation. Yet the alternative scenario presented equally grim prospects for humanity's future. The Emperor's continued deterioration would eventually reach a point where his psychic abilities could no longer maintain the containment barriers, regardless of his will to continue. When that threshold was crossed, the demon forces would break free from the Webway and emerge directly into the Imperial Palace's lower levels, creating a demonic invasion of Terra itself that would make the Horus Heresy's devastation pale in comparison. The heart of the Imperium would become a battleground between human defenders and entities that existed beyond the normal constraints of reality. The Emperor's analysis of these alternatives consumed processing power that he could ill afford to divert from his primary responsibilities, yet the decision's importance demanded careful consideration despite the time constraints imposed by the crisis. His enhanced intellect, capable of performing calculations that would require entire cogitator networks to duplicate, worked through thousands of potential scenarios and their probable outcomes. Each projection painted a picture of humanity's future that grew progressively darker as the variables were adjusted to account for the continuing deterioration of his physical condition. The demon forces within the Webway seemed to sense the Emperor's weakening state, their attacks on the containment barriers becoming more frequent and more coordinated as they detected fluctuations in the psychic fields that held them prisoner. The greater demons leading the invasion began timing their assaults to coincide with moments when the Emperor's attention was divided between multiple critical functions, exploiting brief lapses in concentration to probe for weaknesses in the barrier's structure. These coordinated attacks forced the Master of Mankind to maintain even higher levels of constant vigilance, further accelerating the consumption of his physical resources. The Custodian Guard and Sisters of Silence fighting within the tunnel network began reporting changes in demon behavior that suggested their enemies were receiving increasingly sophisticated tactical guidance from their greater demon commanders. The entities that had initially fought with the mindless fury characteristic of chaos forces were now exhibiting strategic thinking and coordinated tactics that made them far more dangerous opponents. Bloodletters began using the tunnel architecture to create ambush positions, while Plaguebearers established corruption nodes at locations specifically chosen to maximize their strategic impact on Imperial defensive positions. The war within the Webway had evolved from a desperate holding action into a complex military campaign where both sides employed increasingly sophisticated strategies to gain advantage over their opponents. Yet this evolution worked against Imperial interests, as the human forces possessed finite resources and replacements, while their demon enemies could potentially receive unlimited reinforcements through the breach. The Emperor recognized that time itself had become his greatest enemy, with each passing day bringing him closer to the point where physical exhaustion would make continued resistance impossible. The modifications required to maintain the Golden Throne's operation under such extreme conditions pushed the ancient device beyond its original design parameters. Tech priests worked constantly to recalibrate systems that were showing signs of strain from prolonged operation at maximum capacity, while servitor crews performed maintenance on components that had never been intended to function under such demanding circumstances. The throne's psychic amplification matrices were operating at energy levels that caused visible distortions in the surrounding air, while its life support systems struggled to compensate for the Emperor's accelerated metabolic demands. The Emperor's communications with his loyal Primarchs became increasingly focused on contingency planning for scenarios where his direct guidance would no longer be available. Rogaldorn received detailed instructions for the completion of Terra's fortifications, along with strategic assessments of likely attack vectors that Horus might employ during his inevitable assault on the Imperial Palace. These communications took the form of compressed data bursts that conveyed enormous amounts of information in brief telepathic transmissions, allowing the Emperor to provide comprehensive guidance while minimizing the time spent away from his primary responsibilities. The burden of maintaining both the Webway containment and the Astronomican's operation created feedback loops within the Emperor's consciousness that threatened to tear apart even his transcendent psychic abilities. The two functions required different types of mental focus and energy projection, yet both demanded his constant attention to prevent catastrophic failures that could doom humanity to destruction or eternal wandering in the warp's chaotic currents. His enhanced mind, capable of processing information at speeds that approached the theoretical limits of consciousness itself, was pushed to its absolute breaking point by the necessity of maintaining perfect performance in both critical areas simultaneously. The physical symptoms of this mental strain manifested as cellular breakdown that accelerated with each passing week of continued vigilance. The Emperor's enhanced physiology, designed to support psychic abilities far beyond those of normal humans, began showing signs of systematic failure as the energy demands exceeded even its extraordinary capabilities. Muscle tissue broke down to provide fuel for continued brain function, while his cardiovascular system operated at levels that caused visible stress fractures in the walls of major blood vessels. Yet still he maintained his vigil, understanding that any reduction in his efforts would result in consequences that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. The ancient Eldar way station had stood empty for millennia when the demon breach transformed it into a contested battleground that would consume hundreds of lives over the course of a few weeks. The structure rose from the crystalline floor of the Webway tunnel like a frozen waterfall, its wraithbone spires reaching toward a ceiling that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Psychoactive conduits pulsed with residual energy throughout its walls, creating patterns of light that shifted between spectrums visible to human eyes and frequencies that could only be perceived through enhanced augmetic sensors. The way station's strategic importance lay in its position at the convergence of 7 major tunnel branches, making control of the facility essential for maintaining supply lines to Imperial forward positions throughout the sector. Captain General Constantin Valdor had established a garrison of 200 custodians within the structure's lower levels, their golden armor providing stark contrast to the ethereal blue-green glow emanating from the wraithbone walls. The custodians had spent weeks learning to navigate the station's interior, where corridors followed architectural principles that violated human understanding of three-dimensional space. The initial demon assault came without warning, as a pack of 30 bloodletters materialized directly within the way station's central chamber through dimensional rifts that bypassed the Imperial perimeter entirely. The demons emerged from tiers in reality that bled crimson light across the crystalline floor, their brass-scaled forms radiating heat that caused the surrounding wraithbone to crack and splinter. Each demon stood nearly 3 meters tall, their muscular frames supporting heads that resembled fleshless skulls, wreathed in flames that burned without consuming oxygen. Tribune Ammon Toramation led the immediate response, his dread host warriors advancing through passages that shifted configuration as they moved. The Custodians found their usual formation tactics complicated by architecture that could suddenly expand a narrow corridor into a vast chamber, or compress a wide avenue into a bottleneck barely wide enough for a single warrior. The Tribune's guardian spear carved through the leading bloodletter's torso, the weapon's energy field disrupting the demon's molecular cohesion and causing it to dissolve into wisps of sulfurous smoke. The battle's complexity increased exponentially when Tzeentch horrors began manifesting throughout the way station's upper levels, their crystalline forms refracting the structure's ambient light into patterns that induced severe disorientation in human observers. These demons possessed the ability to split into smaller versions of themselves when destroyed, creating a situation where each successful attack by Imperial forces potentially doubled the number of enemies they faced. The horror's presence caused the way station's psychoactive systems to malfunction, with navigation conduits displaying false directional information and environmental controls creating atmospheric conditions that ranged from vacuum to toxic gas concentrations. Shield Captain Diocles Cato established a command post in what had once been the way station's primary control chamber, where banks of crystalline interfaces hummed with energies that defied Imperial understanding. The chamber's walls displayed holographic star charts showing the positions of distant worlds, but the images flickered between current stellar configurations and views of the galaxy from ages past when the Eldar Empire had reached its zenith. Cato's tactical assessments had to account for the possibility that the chamber existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, making conventional strategic planning nearly impossible. The Custodians discovered that conventional weapons performed unpredictably within the way station's psychoactive environment. Bolt rounds that should have detonated on impact instead phased through demon targets, while Guardian spear thrusts that appeared to miss their intended marks somehow found purchase in entities that had been standing meters away from the weapon's trajectory. The structure itself seemed to be actively interfering with Imperial combat effectiveness, as if the ancient Eldar architects had designed their creation to resist occupation by non-psychic species. Sister Superior Tanau Alaya arrived with her prosecution force Umbra on the battle's third day, her Sisters of Silence bringing null field capabilities that immediately began stabilizing the way station's chaotic environment. The Sisters' psychic absence created zones where the Wraithbone architecture returned to stable configurations, allowing the Custodians to establish reliable defensive positions for the first time since the battle began. Alaya positioned her warriors at critical junctions throughout the structure, their null fields creating corridors of normal physics that could be used for tactical movement and supply distribution. The demon forces adapted to the Sisters' presence with disturbing speed, demonstrating tactical flexibility that exceeded anything previously observed in chaos entities. Bloodletters began coordinating their attacks to draw Imperial defenders away from null field zones, while horrors used their reality warping abilities to create alternate routes through the way station that bypassed the Sisters' positions entirely. The greater demon commanding the assault, a bloodthirster whose brass armor bore the scars of 1,000 battles, began employing psychological warfare tactics designed to exploit the isolation and stress experienced by human forces operating in the alien environment. The way station's central spire became the focus of the most intense fighting, as both sides recognized its importance as a vantage point that could dominate the entire structure. The spire's interior consisted of a hollow shaft that extended through multiple dimensional planes, with platforms and walkways that existed at angles impossible in normal space. Custodian assault teams found themselves fighting battles where gravity operated in different directions on each level, while demon forces used their supernatural abilities to move through solid walls and attack from directions that should not have existed. Aquilus of the Shadowkeepers distinguished himself during the Spire assault by developing techniques that exploited the structure's dimensional instability against demon forces. The veteran custodian observed that the spire's psychoactive properties responded to focused will and intention, allowing skilled operators to manipulate the architecture itself as a weapon. By concentrating on specific geometric configurations, Aquilus could cause walkways to shift position, trapping demon forces in dead-end passages, or creating new routes that allowed Imperial forces to outflank their enemies. The battle's turning point came when Sister Alaya made the decision to extend her null field to maximum intensity while positioned at the spire's apex, creating a zone of absolute psychic negation that encompassed the entire structure. The effort required her to draw upon reserves of will that pushed her enhanced nervous system beyond its normal operating limits, but the effect on the demon forces was immediate and devastating. The bloodthirster leading the assault found itself suddenly cut off from its connection to Khorne's realm, its supernatural abilities failing as it was forced into purely material existence. The greater demon's rage at this development manifested as a berserker assault that carved through 3 levels of the spire's interior, its massive axe cleaving through wraithbone walls as if they were constructed from paper. The creature's fury generated heat signatures that caused atmospheric ignition in several chambers, creating firestorms that threatened to consume both Imperial and demon forces alike. Yet without its supernatural resilience and regenerative abilities, the bloodthirster proved vulnerable to concentrated fire from custodian weapons, its brass armor cracking under the impact of guardian spear thrusts that found their mark with unprecedented accuracy. The demon's final moments demonstrated the complex relationship between chaos entities and the psychic energies that sustain their existence in the material realm. As Sister Alaya's null field continued to negate the creature's connection to the Imperium, the bloodthirster's form began losing molecular cohesion, its brass scales falling away like autumn leaves, while its muscular frame dissolved into ectoplasmic residue. The process took nearly an hour to complete, during which the demon experienced what could only be described as a form of existence that violated every principle governing its nature. The victory at Nexus Gamma Tertius provided Imperial forces with crucial intelligence about demon vulnerabilities within the Webway's unique environment, but the cost in human lives had been severe. 47 custodians had fallen during the 17-day battle, while 6 Sisters of Silence required extensive medical treatment for neural damage caused by prolonged exposure to null field stress. The way station itself bore scars that would never fully heal, its wraithbone structure marked by burn patterns and dimensional fractures that continued to propagate through the crystalline matrix months after the battle's conclusion. The tactical lessons learned during the way station assault informed Imperial strategy throughout the broader Webway campaign, particularly regarding the challenges posed by fighting in environments where geography could shift without warning. Tribune Toramation developed new formation protocols that emphasized flexibility and rapid adaptation, training his warriors to fight effectively regardless of whether they found themselves in narrow corridors or vast chambers. These techniques proved essential during subsequent engagements in sectors where the tunnel architecture responded to emotional states and combat stress by reconfiguring itself in real time. The Maze of Echoing Sorrows presented perhaps the most psychologically challenging battlefield encountered by Imperial forces during the early phases of the war. This section of the Webway had been corrupted by Slaanesh demons, whose presence transformed the crystalline passages into a labyrinth designed to exploit the deepest fears and desires of anyone who entered it. The walls themselves became mirrors that reflected not physical appearances, but psychological states, showing observers visions of their greatest triumphs and most shameful failures in vivid detail that could paralyze even the most disciplined warriors. Shield Captain Kato led a strike force of 100 custodians into the maze, with the objective of clearing a path to the Obsidian Gate, a critical junction that connected to tunnel networks spanning half the galaxy. The mission parameters seemed straightforward, but the maze's psychological effects began manifesting within hours of the Imperial forces' entry. Custodians who had served the Emperor for centuries found themselves confronting memories they had believed purged from their consciousness, while others experienced visions of alternate futures where their loyalty had taken different forms. The demon forces inhabiting the maze used these psychological vulnerabilities as weapons, manifesting as figures from the Custodians' past who spoke in voices that carried the weight of absolute authority. Some warriors found themselves face to face with fallen comrades whose deaths they had witnessed, while others confronted images of the Emperor himself that seemed to question their dedication and worthiness. The maze's architecture amplified these encounters by creating acoustic effects that made whispered words sound like thunderous proclamations, while visual distortions caused shadows to take on lives of their own. Sister Commander Janisha Kroll's intervention proved crucial for maintaining Imperial cohesion within the maze's corrupted environment. Her anathema Templars created zones of psychic silence that disrupted the maze's ability to generate psychological illusions, though the null field's interaction with the Slaaneshi corruption produced side effects that no one had anticipated. Areas where the sisters operated began exhibiting what could only be described as emotional vacuum, creating spaces where human feelings ceased to function entirely and leaving Imperial warriors in states of complete affective numbness. The advance through the maze required 19 days of continuous fighting, as demon forces used the labyrinth's shifting passages to conduct hit-and-run attacks that prevented Imperial forces from establishing secure positions. Daemonics would emerge from walls that had appeared solid moments before, their claws seeking vulnerable joints in custodian armor, while their hypnotic voices whispered promises of pleasures that could make the warriors forget their duty entirely. The creature's supernatural grace allowed them to move through the maze's twisted geometry as if it were open terrain, appearing and disappearing through dimensional rifts that human minds could barely perceive. The psychological toll on Imperial forces became evident as the mission progressed, with even the most disciplined custodians showing signs of stress that manifested as decreased reaction times and impaired tactical judgment. Some warriors began experiencing auditory hallucinations that persisted even when they operated within sister null field zones, suggesting that prolonged exposure to Slaaneshi influence could create permanent changes in human neural patterns. Medical personnel reported treating symptoms that had no precedent in Imperial military medicine, including cases where warriors claimed to experience physical sensations from injuries that existed only in their memories. The breakthrough came when Aquilus discovered that the maze's configuration followed mathematical principles based on the emotional states of those within it, rather than conventional architectural logic. By maintaining rigid mental discipline and focusing on abstract tactical concepts rather than personal experiences, small groups of custodians could navigate passages that would otherwise have led them in circles for eternity. This technique required extraordinary psychological strength, as it demanded that warriors suppress not just fear and desire, but all emotional responses that made them recognizably human. The final assault on the Obsidian Gate required a coordinated attack by forces operating on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, as the demon defenders had established positions that existed partially outside normal space-time. Custodian strike teams advanced through passages that led to the same destination through different dimensional routes, while Sisters of Silence created null field corridors that allowed the various groups to maintain communication despite operating in separate reality planes. The complexity of the operation pushed Imperial tactical doctrine to its absolute limits, requiring split-second coordination between units that could not directly observe each other's positions. The Gate's liberation revealed the true scope of the demon threat within the Webway, as intelligence gathered from captured Slaaneshi positions indicated that corruption had spread throughout tunnel networks connecting to dozens of worlds across the galaxy. The Obsidian Gate served as a hub for demon reconnaissance missions that had already reached the outskirts of several major Imperial systems, while other passages showed signs of recent demon traffic that suggested scouting expeditions were probing defenses on worlds whose populations had no knowledge of the threat approaching them. The strategic implications of these discoveries forced Imperial commanders to confront the reality that their defensive strategy was fundamentally flawed. Rather than containing the demon incursion within a limited area of the Webway, Imperial forces were fighting a delaying action against enemies who possessed superior knowledge of the tunnel network's layout and could potentially emerge anywhere in the galaxy without warning. The war had evolved from a crisis-threatening Terra into a potential catastrophe that could bring demon armies directly into the heart of human civilization across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. The gradual Imperial retreat toward Terra began as a series of tactical withdrawals from positions that had become untenable due to demon infiltration and the progressive failure of supply lines stretched across impossible distances. Forward bases that had been established during the early phases of the campaign found themselves surrounded by enemies who had bypassed Imperial defensive lines through passages that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. The retreat required careful coordination to prevent isolated garrisons from being overwhelmed by demon forces that could attack from any direction without warning. The evacuation of Firebase Aurum demonstrated both the challenges and the costs associated with withdrawing from established positions within the Webway's hostile environment. The base had been constructed around a major junction that controlled access to 17 different tunnel branches, making its abandonment a significant strategic loss that would allow demon forces to threaten Imperial positions throughout the sector. Yet the Firebase's defenders had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective fighters after months of continuous combat, while demon reconnaissance had identified at least 3 separate approach routes that could be used for coordinated assaults. The withdrawal operation required the destruction of critical infrastructure to prevent demon forces from using captured Imperial equipment and facilities. Demolition charges planted throughout the Firebase's structure were designed to collapse the junction's crystalline architecture, sealing off the tunnel branches to prevent demon expansion into uncontaminated areas of the network. However, the Webway's psychoactive properties meant that conventional explosives produced unpredictable effects, with some detonations creating dimensional rifts that allowed demon forces to bypass the intended barriers entirely. The deeper the Imperial forces penetrated into the Webway's labyrinthine passages, the more apparent it became that humanity was trespassing in a realm shaped by minds utterly alien to their own. What the Emperor had envisioned as mankind's pathway to transcendence revealed itself as a monument to a civilization whose achievements dwarfed even the greatest accomplishments of the Dark Age of technology. The tunnels themselves were merely the surface layer of a construct that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, its true scope extending through realms where distance and time followed principles that human science could barely comprehend. Captain General Constantin Valdor's exploration teams began encountering dormant Eldar constructs during their 3rd month of operations within the tunnel network. These ancient installations had lain inactive for millennia, their crystalline forms pulsing with residual energies that suggested technological capabilities far beyond anything in the Imperial arsenal. The first discovery occurred in a chamber designated Vault Sigma 9, where a towering spire of wraithbone rose from the floor like a frozen tree, its surface covered in geometric patterns that shifted between visibility and transparency as observers moved around it. The spire's base was surrounded by smaller constructs that resembled metallic flowers, their petals composed of materials that existed in a constant state of flux between solid and gaseous phases. When Custodian artificers attempted to analyze these devices using standard Imperial equipment, their Auspex readings showed impossible results that suggested the constructs operated according to physical laws that had no equivalent in human understanding. Some readings indicated negative mass, while others showed energy signatures that appeared to violate conservation principles by generating more power than they consumed. Magos Dominus Kelberhal accompanied several expeditions into the deeper vault systems, his augmented senses struggling to process data from constructs that seemed designed to operate on principles that transcended conventional matter-energy interactions. The Fabricator General's most sophisticated analytical equipment registered the presence of exotic particles that should not have been able to exist within normal spacetime, while gravitometric sensors detected localized distortions that suggested some devices were manipulating fundamental forces at the quantum level. The Wraithbone constructs responded to proximity in ways that indicated a form of consciousness that persisted even after millennia of dormancy. As Imperial personnel approached certain installations, crystalline surfaces would begin glowing with soft phosphorescence, while geometric patterns flowed across their exteriors like living tattoos. The responses seemed purposeful rather than automatic, suggesting that whatever intelligence governed these systems was evaluating the newcomers and making decisions about how to react to their presence. Tribune Hedo Venator's emissaries Imperatus discovered that some constructs could be activated through direct psychic contact, though the process required extraordinary mental discipline to avoid being overwhelmed by alien thought patterns. When a custodian with minor psychic sensitivity placed his hand on a dormant control surface, the entire chamber erupted in holographic displays showing star charts that mapped not just physical space but dimensional pathways that connected distant regions of the galaxy through routes that bypassed normal spacetime entirely. The star charts revealed the true scope of the Webway network, displaying connections between worlds that lay tens of thousands of light years apart in real space, but stood mere hours distant through the tunnel system. The maps showed pathways leading to star systems that Imperial astronomers had never catalogued, while other routes connected to regions of space that appeared to exist outside the galaxy entirely. Most disturbing were the passages that led to coordinates showing no stellar objects at all, suggesting destinations that might exist in pocket dimensions created specifically to serve Eldar purposes. The ancient navigation systems that controlled access to these far-flung destinations operated through interfaces that required users to think in mathematical concepts that human minds found almost impossible to grasp. The control mechanisms responded to thoughts expressed as geometric relationships rather than linear sequences, demanding that operators visualize space-time as a fluid medium that could be shaped through focused will rather than mechanical manipulation. Imperial personnel who attempted to use these systems reported experiencing severe disorientation as their consciousness was forced to process spatial relationships that violated every principle of human psychology. Deeper exploration revealed automated defense systems that had continued functioning long after their creators' civilization had fallen into decline. These guardian constructs took forms that defied easy categorization, appearing as geometric shapes that moved through three-dimensional space while simultaneously existing in dimensions that human perception could not directly access. When activated by unauthorized intrusion, the Guardians would manifest as crystalline entities whose attacks operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, striking targets with weapons that could phase through physical armor while inflicting damage that existed partially outside normal spacetime. The first encounter with active Guardian systems occurred when a Custodian patrol entered a chamber containing what appeared to be a massive library of crystalline data storage devices. The room's walls were lined with thousands of Wraithbone matrices, each one pulsing with information patterns that suggested vast repositories of knowledge preserved in formats that could survive for geological ages. As the Custodians approached the central storage array, the chamber's defensive protocols activated, manifesting three Guardian constructs that emerged from the floor like sculptures coming to life. The Guardians moved with fluid grace that made their crystalline forms appear almost organic, their surfaces refracting light in patterns that created optical illusions designed to confuse targeting systems. Their primary weapons consisted of energy projectors that fired beams of coherent force rather than conventional plasma or laser emissions, creating attacks that could penetrate Auramite armor by existing partially outside the normal electromagnetic spectrum. The weapon's effects on human tissue were particularly disturbing, as they seemed to target the quantum bonds that held molecular structures together rather than simply applying thermal or kinetic energy. Shield Captain Diocles Cato's tactical analysis of Guardian combat capabilities revealed that the constructs operated according to combat algorithms that had been refined over millions of years of operation. The entities demonstrated perfect coordination without any apparent communication between units, suggesting that they shared a collective consciousness that allowed them to function as components of a larger tactical system. Their defensive protocols included the ability to adapt their combat patterns in real time based on enemy behavior, making them increasingly difficult to defeat as engagements progressed. The Guardians' most unsettling characteristic was their apparent reluctance to inflict unnecessary casualties, suggesting that their programming included ethical constraints that prevented them from using their full destructive potential against intruders who posed no direct threat to critical systems. When Custodians withdrew from protected areas, the constructs would cease their attacks and return to dormant states rather than pursuing retreating forces. This behavior indicated that the ancient Eldar had designed their defensive systems to protect specific assets rather than simply eliminate all unauthorized personnel. The revelation of the Webway's true nature as an Eldar creation spanning millions of years emerged gradually as Imperial exploration teams cataloged the evidence found throughout the tunnel network. Archaeological analysis of the Wraithbone structures revealed construction techniques that had evolved over vast periods of time, with older sections showing simpler architectural patterns, while more recent additions displayed increasing sophistication in both form and function. The network had clearly grown through accretion over geological ages, with each generation of Eldar builders adding new passages and facilities to an ever-expanding system. Carbon dating of organic materials found within sealed chambers provided evidence that some sections of the Webway had been constructed during the earliest phases of Eldar civilization, when their empire was still expanding across the galaxy through conventional faster-than-light travel. These ancient passages showed signs of having been built using techniques that required massive expenditures of physical labor and conventional materials, suggesting that the Eldar had originally conceived the network as a practical transportation system, rather than the reality-manipulating construct it had eventually become. Later additions to the network demonstrated the gradual refinement of Eldar's psychic abilities and their increasing mastery over the fundamental forces governing space and time. Passages constructed during the height of their empire showed evidence of having been shaped through pure mental force, with no tool marks or construction joints visible anywhere in their crystalline structure. The Wraithbone itself had been grown rather than assembled, its molecular matrix responding to psychic direction to assume whatever configuration its creators desired. The most recent sections of the network, constructed during the final millennia before the Fall, displayed technological sophistication that pushed the boundaries of what seemed physically possible. These passages existed in states of dimensional flux that allowed them to occupy the same physical coordinates as multiple other locations simultaneously, creating a transportation network that could connect any point in the galaxy to any other point through routes that bypassed the normal constraints of space-time entirely. The engineering principles underlying these constructs suggested that their creators had achieved mastery over forces that Imperial science could not even detect, much less manipulate. Sister Superior Tano Alaya's prosecution force, Umbra, made the most significant discovery regarding the network's original purpose when they encountered a vast chamber containing what could only be described as a three-dimensional map of the entire galaxy. The installation consisted of millions of tiny lights suspended in a crystalline matrix, each one representing a star system connected to the Webway network through passages of varying complexity and capacity. The map showed the network at its peak development, when Eldar civilization had achieved transportation links to virtually every inhabited world in the galaxy. The map's interactive capabilities allowed users to trace specific routes between distant star systems, displaying travel times and capacity limitations for each passage in the network. The information revealed that the Eldar had achieved transportation capabilities that made their empire effectively instantaneous in its responses to threats or opportunities anywhere in the galaxy. Military forces could be deployed from one edge of the galaxy to the other within hours, while commercial traffic could move goods and materials across vast distances without the delays and dangers associated with warp travel. The tragic irony of humanity's situation became increasingly apparent as Imperial personnel studied the evidence of Eldar achievement throughout the tunnel network. The Emperor's grand design for human transcendence had been based on claiming and adapting a transportation system that represented the pinnacle of another species' technological development, achieved through millions of years of gradual refinement and expansion. Humanity was attempting to master in decades what the Eldar had required geological ages to perfect, using techniques and principles that human science barely understood. The timing of humanity's intrusion into the Webway coincided almost exactly with the nadir of Eldar civilization following their fall to chaos. The network that had once connected a galaxy-spanning empire to its most remote outposts now served primarily as a refuge for the scattered survivors of a species that had destroyed itself through excess and hubris. The passages that had once carried the commerce and culture of the galaxy's dominant civilization had become highways for the very chaos entities that had consumed their creators. The automated systems that continued to function throughout the network served as monuments to Eldar achievement while simultaneously highlighting the magnitude of their civilization's collapse. Constructs that had been designed to serve billions of citizens across thousands of worlds now operated in isolation, maintaining facilities that would never again see their intended users. The Guardian systems that had once protected Eldar installations from external threats now defended empty chambers against intruders who represented the network's only hope for renewed purpose. The deeper Imperial forces penetrated into the network's core systems, the more evidence they found of desperate attempts by surviving Eldar to maintain their civilization's greatest achievement in the face of apocalyptic collapse. Emergency protocols had been activated throughout vast sections of the network, sealing off passages that led to demon-infested worlds while redirecting traffic through alternate routes that could bypass contaminated areas. Maintenance systems had been reprogrammed to operate autonomously for extended periods, ensuring that critical infrastructure would continue functioning even if no Eldar remained to oversee its operation. Some chambers contained what appeared to be final messages from Eldar engineers and architects, their thoughts preserved in crystalline matrices that could convey emotional content as well as factual information. These records spoke of desperate efforts to preserve their civilization's knowledge for future generations, while simultaneously expressing grief for the billions of lives lost to the catastrophe that had consumed their empire. The messages revealed that at least some Eldar had recognized the possibility that other species might eventually discover and attempt to use their transportation network. The records included warnings about the dangers inherent in operating Webway systems without proper understanding of their underlying principles, along with detailed explanations of safety protocols that could prevent catastrophic failures. The Eldar engineers had apparently foreseen the possibility that less advanced species might attempt to use their network, and had included guidance designed to prevent such users from accidentally destroying themselves or damaging the network's delicate infrastructure. These warnings proved prophetic when Imperial analysis revealed that Magnus the Red's psychic assault had damaged far more than just the barriers protecting Terra from demon incursion. The breach had disrupted fundamental systems that maintained stability throughout vast sections of the network, creating cascade failures that continued to propagate through the crystalline matrix months after the initial damage occurred. The Eldar safety protocols that might have contained such failures had been bypassed or overridden by the Emperor's modifications to accommodate human operational requirements. The evidence of Eldar foresight regarding the network's eventual use by other species created complex emotional responses among Imperial personnel who encountered it. The realization that humanity was following a path that the network's creators had anticipated, complete with warnings about the specific dangers that Imperial forces were currently facing, highlighted the magnitude of human ignorance regarding the forces they were attempting to manipulate. The Eldar had achieved mastery over principles that human science could barely detect, yet their civilization had still fallen to the very forces that now threatened to consume humanity through the breach in their network. The ancient constructs that continued to function throughout the tunnel system served as constant reminders of the technological gap between human achievement and Eldar mastery. Devices that Imperial tech priests could barely understand continued operating flawlessly after millennia of neglect, their self-maintenance systems preserving functionality that exceeded anything in the Imperial arsenal. The contrast between human struggle to maintain basic equipment in the hostile environment and Eldar technology that seemed to thrive under the same conditions emphasized the presumption inherent in humanity's attempt to claim the network for their own use. The automated systems showed increasing signs of recognizing human presence as something more than mere intrusion, with some constructs beginning to respond to Imperial personnel in ways that suggested evaluation rather than simple threat assessment. Certain facilities would activate when approached by humans carrying specific types of equipment or displaying particular behavioral patterns, suggesting that the network's intelligence systems were learning to distinguish between different categories of users and adjusting their responses accordingly. The simultaneous nature of the crises facing the Imperium created a strategic nightmare that stretched Imperial resources beyond their breaking point. While Horus Lupercal marshaled his traitor legions for the final assault on Terra, the Emperor found himself locked in an increasingly desperate battle to prevent demonic forces from erupting into the Imperial Palace from below. The War Master's approach toward humanity's birthworld proceeded according to carefully calculated timetables, his fleet movements coordinated to maximize psychological pressure on the defenders, while his ground forces prepared for siege operations that would determine the fate of human civilization. Rogel Dorn's defensive preparations had transformed the Imperial Palace into the most formidable fortress in human history, yet the Praetorian of Terra faced the unprecedented challenge of defending against threats approaching from two entirely different dimensions. His surface fortifications incorporated every lesson learned during the Great Crusade's countless siege operations, with overlapping fields of fire, redundant supply lines, and fallback positions designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. The massive gun batteries positioned throughout the palace complex could reduce attacking armies to ash within minutes, while void shield generators created protective barriers capable of deflecting orbital bombardment. Yet these conventional defenses meant nothing against enemies that could emerge directly within the palace's lower levels through dimensional rifts that bypassed every physical barrier. The Emperor's struggle to contain the demon incursion had created a secondary battlefront that demanded significant portions of the palace's most elite defenders, forces that would otherwise have been available to repel Horus's surface assault. The Adeptus Custodians, who should have formed the final line of defense around the Emperor's person, were instead scattered throughout the Webway's tunnels, their numbers steadily diminished by months of grinding warfare against entities that could not be permanently destroyed. The coordination between surface and underground operations required constant communication between Dorn and the few Custodian commanders who remained in contact with Imperial command centers. Captain General Constantin Valdor's tactical assessments reached the Praetorian through heavily encrypted Vox transmissions that described a deteriorating situation in the tunnels below, where Imperial forces were conducting an increasingly desperate fighting retreat toward Terra's primary breach point. Each report detailed further losses among irreplaceable warriors, whose enhanced capabilities made them far more valuable than entire regiments of conventional troops. Dorn's strategic calculations had to account for the possibility that demon forces might break through the underground containment at any moment, potentially emerging within the palace complex, while his surface defenses were engaged with Horus's assault. The Praetorian established emergency protocols that would allow rapid redeployment of forces between surface and underground positions, though such movements would necessarily weaken whichever front was temporarily abandoned. The palace's internal security systems were modified to detect dimensional anomalies that might indicate demon manifestation, while quick response teams were positioned at critical locations throughout the complex. The Sisters of Silence represented a crucial asset that both battlefronts desperately needed, their null field abilities proving essential for combating demon forces, while their combat skills made them valuable additions to any defensive position. Sister Commander Janisha Kroll found herself forced to divide her already limited forces between Webway operations and surface defense preparations, knowing that insufficient strength on either front could result in catastrophic failure. The Silent Sisterhood's deployment schedules became increasingly complex as commanders attempted to maximize their effectiveness across multiple simultaneous crises. The strain on Imperial logistics became apparent as supply lines struggled to support operations on both fronts simultaneously. The Webway garrison required specialized equipment designed to function in the tunnel network's psychoactive environment, while surface defenders needed conventional ammunition and supplies for extended siege operations. Manufacturing facilities within the palace complex operated at maximum capacity, yet production rates could not keep pace with consumption, as both battlefronts demanded ever-increasing quantities of materiel. Tech priests assigned to equipment maintenance found themselves overwhelmed by the unique challenges posed by gear that had been exposed to the Webway's hostile environment. Weapons and armor that returned from tunnel operations required extensive purification rituals to remove demon taint, while their mechanical components showed accelerated wear patterns that defied conventional understanding. The contamination spread through shared equipment pools, forcing the establishment of separate supply chains for surface and underground operations to prevent cross-contamination that could compromise the effectiveness of both forces. The psychological impact on Imperial personnel became increasingly severe as reports filtered up from the tunnel fighting described battles against enemies that violated every principle of rational warfare. Surface defenders who had trained for conventional siege operations found themselves facing the possibility of combat against entities that could phase through solid walls, manipulate local reality, and attack on psychological levels that conventional armor could not protect against. The knowledge that such enemies might emerge anywhere within the palace complex created constant tension that affected combat effectiveness even when no actual demon incursions occurred. Medical facilities struggled to treat casualties from both fronts, as wounds inflicted by demon weapons required entirely different treatment protocols from conventional battle injuries. Apothecaries trained in standard trauma procedures found themselves unprepared for damage that existed partially outside normal space-time, while the limited number of specialists qualified to treat demon-inflicted injuries became overwhelmed by the steady stream of casualties from the underground war. The establishment of separate medical facilities for each battlefront stretched personnel resources, while creating additional security risks as contaminated materials had to be isolated and disposed of according to strict protocols. The Emperor's deteriorating condition created additional complications for both defensive operations, as his reduced availability for strategic guidance forced subordinate commanders to make increasingly important decisions without his direct input. Rogel Dorn found himself relying on fragmented telepathic communications that conveyed critical information in compressed bursts of pure thought, requiring him to interpret strategic guidance that arrived as emotional impressions rather than detailed tactical instructions. The Praetorian's enhanced intellect allowed him to extrapolate comprehensive defensive strategies from these limited communications, yet the process demanded cognitive resources that would otherwise have been devoted to tactical planning. The coordination of intelligence gathering between surface and underground operations revealed disturbing patterns in demon behavior that suggested their commanders possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial defensive preparations. Chaos entities operating within the Webway demonstrated awareness of surface fortification layouts and troop dispositions that should have been impossible to obtain through normal reconnaissance. The possibility that demon forces were receiving intelligence from traitor elements within the palace complex created paranoia that affected operational security throughout both battlefronts. Counterintelligence operations conducted by the Silent Sisterhood and loyal elements of the Imperial Army uncovered evidence of psychic infiltration attempts that bypassed conventional security measures. Demon entities had apparently developed techniques for implanting false memories and altered loyalties in Imperial personnel through brief psychic contact, creating sleeper agents whose compromised status might not become apparent until critical moments during the siege. The discovery of these infiltration techniques forced the implementation of extensive screening procedures that slowed operational tempo while consuming additional resources. The establishment of secure communication networks between surface and underground commands required the installation of psychically shielded relay stations throughout the palace complex. These facilities used archaeotech components recovered from the deepest vaults beneath Terra, their crystalline matrices capable of transmitting information through dimensions that demon forces could not easily intercept. The relay network's construction demanded significant engineering resources, while its operation required constant monitoring by tech priests whose augmented senses could detect dimensional interference patterns that might indicate enemy interception attempts. The integration of Titan Legion elements into both defensive operations created unique logistical challenges, as the massive war engines required specialized maintenance facilities and supply chains that had not been designed to support simultaneous deployment on multiple fronts. Legio Ignatum's Warhound scouts that had been modified for Webway operations could not easily be redeployed to surface positions due to the extensive alterations required for tunnel warfare, while conventional Titans assigned to surface defense lacked the specialized equipment needed for underground combat. The division of available war engines between fronts reduced the concentrated firepower available to either operation while increasing maintenance requirements across the board. The temporal aspects of the crisis became increasingly apparent as intelligence reports indicated that Horus's approach toward Terra was being coordinated with demon activity within the Webway. Traitor fleet movements seemed timed to coincide with major demon assaults on the underground containment barriers, suggesting that the Warmaster possessed detailed knowledge of the Emperor's situation and was planning his surface assault to exploit moments of maximum strain on the Imperial defenses. This coordination implied communication channels between the traitor forces and demon entities that operated outside normal space-time limitations. The strategic implications of this coordination forced Dorn to consider defensive scenarios where surface and underground battles might reach their climaxes simultaneously, creating a situation where Imperial forces would face maximum pressure on both fronts at the same moment. The Praetorians' contingency planning had to account for the possibility that the Emperor might be forced to abandon the Webway containment in order to participate in repelling Horus's assault, potentially releasing demon hordes into the palace complex at the worst possible moment. These scenarios required the pre-positioning of specialized equipment and personnel capable of conducting emergency demon containment operations using conventional military assets. The modification of palace defense systems to detect and respond to demon incursions required extensive cooperation between the Adeptus Mechanicus and surviving custodian technical specialists. Sensor arrays designed to monitor conventional approaches were recalibrated to detect dimensional anomalies and psychic emanations that might indicate demon manifestation, while automated defense turrets were equipped with blessed ammunition and psychically charged power cells. The installation of these modifications consumed resources that would otherwise have been devoted to strengthening surface fortifications, yet the alternative of leaving the palace's interior undefended against potential demon breakthrough was unacceptable. The training of conventional Imperial Army units for potential demon combat created additional strain on personnel resources, as soldiers who had prepared for siege warfare against traitor Astartes found themselves learning techniques for fighting enemies that operated according to entirely different principles. Standard Imperial Guard doctrine emphasized coordination, disciplined fire, and tactical flexibility, Yet these approaches proved inadequate against entities that could phase through solid matter, manipulate local reality, or attack on psychological levels that conventional training could not address. The development of new tactical doctrines required extensive consultation with custodian veterans who possessed actual combat experience against demon forces. The establishment of emergency evacuation routes from critical palace facilities to secure positions became a priority as planners recognized that demon breakthrough might occur with little or no warning. These routes had to account for the possibility that conventional passages might be blocked by dimensional anomalies or demon forces, requiring the creation of alternate pathways that could function even under the most extreme circumstances. The construction of these emergency systems demanded engineering expertise that was already stretched thin between surface fortification projects and Webway containment efforts. The psychological preparation of Imperial personnel for the possibility of demon combat proved as challenging as the tactical training, as human minds struggled to accept the reality of enemies that violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. Chaplains and commissars worked to maintain morale among troops who faced the prospect of fighting entities that could corrupt their souls through mere proximity, while medical personnel prepared treatments for forms of psychological trauma that had no precedent in Imperial military experience. The knowledge that such enemies might emerge anywhere within the palace complex created constant stress that affected combat readiness even when no actual threats materialized. The resource allocation decisions forced upon Imperial commanders highlighted the impossible nature of their strategic situation, as every asset committed to one front necessarily weakened the other. The Custodian Guard represented the most capable anti-demon forces available, yet their deployment in the Webway meant fewer elite warriors available for protecting critical surface positions during Horus's assault. Similarly, every Sister of Silence assigned to underground operations was one less null field generator available for countering traitor psychers during the surface battle. The optimization of these deployments required constant reassessment as conditions changed on both fronts. The intelligence gathered from captured demon entities revealed disturbing information about the scope of the threat facing the Imperium, as interrogation techniques developed specifically for dealing with immaterial beings uncovered evidence of coordination between different chaos factions that extended far beyond the immediate Terra crisis. The demon forces operating within the Webway appeared to be components of a larger strategic plan that encompassed not just the immediate assault on Terra, but long-term objectives for the corruption of human civilization throughout the galaxy. This intelligence suggested that even if the immediate crisis could be resolved, the underlying threat would continue to grow until it eventually overwhelmed Imperial defenses through sheer persistence. The weight of impossible choices pressed down upon the Emperor as demon forces within the Webway grew increasingly bold in their attempts to breach the psychic barriers that held them contained. Each coordinated assault by the greater demons commanding the invasion forced him to divert more energy from the Astronomican's operation, creating cascading effects throughout the galaxy as Imperial fleets found themselves navigating increasingly treacherous warp currents without reliable guidance. The master of mankind's consciousness stretched between maintaining dimensional barriers and projecting his psychic beacon across the void, began showing signs of strain that manifested as cellular breakdown in his physical form seated upon the Golden Throne. The tactical situation reports reaching the Emperor through fragmented communications painted an increasingly dire picture of the war raging in the tunnels beneath Terra. Captain General Constantin Valdor's forces had been reduced to fewer than 6,000 effective fighters, their golden ranks thinned by months of grinding warfare against enemies that could not be permanently destroyed. The Sisters of Silence, whose null field abilities represented humanity's most effective weapon against demonic entities, had suffered proportional casualties that left critical sectors of the tunnel network vulnerable to infiltration by chaos forces, whose supernatural abilities allowed them to bypass conventional defensive positions. The Custodian Guards fighting retreat toward Terra's primary breach point had become a series of desperate holding actions at choke points that could barely contain the demon hordes pressing against Imperial defensive lines. Tribune Ammon Toramations reports described battles where reality itself had become a weapon, with demon sorcerers reshaping tunnel architecture to create killing fields that violated basic principles of three-dimensional space. The ancient Eldar constructs that formed the Webway's infrastructure were being corrupted by prolonged exposure to chaos energies, their psychoactive properties turning against the human defenders who had never fully understood the principles governing their operation. The Emperor's analysis of strategic alternatives consumed processing power that he could ill afford to divert from his primary responsibilities, yet the decision's importance demanded careful consideration despite the time constraints imposed by the deteriorating situation. His enhanced intellect worked through thousands of potential scenarios, each projection painting increasingly dark pictures of humanity's future regardless of which path he chose. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Maintaining the current defensive posture would eventually result in complete failure as his physical form succumbed to the metabolic demands of dual psychic projection, while abandoning the Webway project would condemn thousands of loyal warriors to death or worse fates in the tunnels below. The cascade failures spreading throughout the tunnel network's crystalline matrix had reached a critical threshold where structural collapse threatened to create additional dimensional breaches that could allow demon forces to emerge at random locations across Terra's surface. The Wraithbone constructs that maintained dimensional stability were showing signs of systematic failure as their psychoactive properties responded to the overwhelming presence of chaos entities within the network. Tech priests monitoring the situation reported that the rate of deterioration was accelerating exponentially, with each failed construct contributing to the instability of neighboring structures in a process that could potentially consume the entire network within months. The intelligence gathered from demon interrogations revealed that the Chaos forces were aware of the Emperor's weakening condition and had begun timing their assaults to exploit moments when his attention was divided between critical functions. The greater demons commanding the invasion possessed supernatural awareness that allowed them to detect fluctuations in the psychic barriers containing them, coordinating their attacks to occur during periods of maximum vulnerability. This tactical sophistication indicated that the demon forces were receiving guidance from entities whose understanding of human psychology exceeded anything previously encountered by Imperial forces. The coordination between demon activity and Horus's approach toward Terra had become undeniable, with traitor fleet movements timed to coincide with major assaults on the underground containment barriers. Intelligence reports suggested that the War Master possessed detailed knowledge of the Emperor's situation and was planning his surface assault to begin at the moment when the Master of Mankind would be least capable of providing direct support to the palace's defenders. This coordination implied communication channels between traitor and demon forces that operated outside normal space-time limitations, allowing real-time tactical cooperation despite the vast distances involved. The realization that continued resistance was ultimately futile forced the Emperor to confront the most painful decision of his millennia-long existence. The Webway project, which had represented humanity's best hope for transcending its dangerous dependence on warp travel and achieving independence from the predations of chaos, would have to be abandoned to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The tunnel network that should have connected human worlds across the galaxy through safe passages had become a highway for demonic invasion that threatened to bring the forces of the Imperium directly into the heart of Imperial civilization. The technical requirements for sealing the Imperial Webway gate permanently demanded a level of psychic energy that would consume the remainder of the Emperor's physical reserves while binding his consciousness to the Golden Throne indefinitely. The process involved more than simply closing the dimensional aperture that connected Terra to the tunnel network. It required the creation of permanent barriers that could withstand assault by entities whose power operated on cosmic scales. These barriers would need constant reinforcement through direct psychic projection, making the emperor's imprisonment upon the throne a permanent condition rather than a temporary necessity. The emperor's decision to proceed with the sealing carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, fundamentally altering humanity's trajectory for millennia to come. The abandonment of the Webway project meant that mankind would remain dependent on navigator houses for interstellar travel, maintaining the dangerous reliance on psychers that had made human civilization vulnerable to chaos corruption. The monopolistic control exercised by the navigator families over faster-than-light transportation would continue indefinitely, preventing the development of alternative methods that might have reduced humanity's psychic footprint in the Imperium. The preparation for the sealing operation required extensive modifications to the Golden Throne systems, as the ancient device had never been designed to channel the enormous energies necessary for permanent dimensional manipulation. Tech priests worked frantically to recalibrate psychic amplification matrices that were already operating beyond their design parameters, while servitor crews installed additional life support systems to sustain the Emperor's physical form during the extended period of maximum psychic output. The modifications pushed the throne's archaeotech components to their absolute limits, with several critical systems showing signs of stress fractures that could potentially cause catastrophic failure during the sealing process. The withdrawal of Imperial forces from the Webway began as a carefully coordinated fighting retreat designed to extract as many personnel as possible before the dimensional barriers were permanently sealed. Captain General Valdor's remaining Custodians conducted a series of delaying actions that allowed the evacuation of wounded personnel and critical equipment, though the process required the abandonment of fortified positions that had cost hundreds of lives to establish. The Sisters of Silence provided rear guard support through their null field abilities, creating zones of psychic negation that disrupted demon pursuit, while Imperial forces withdrew through passages that were already showing signs of structural instability. The evacuation operation highlighted the scope of the sacrifice being demanded by the Emperor's decision, as thousands of loyal warriors who had served with distinction throughout the tunnel campaign found themselves trapped in sectors that could not be reached before the sealing commenced. Tribune Hido Venator's emissaries Imperatus had been cut off during a reconnaissance mission to the network's outer reaches, their Vox transmissions growing increasingly faint as demon forces closed in around their position. Sister Superior Tano, Elia's prosecution force Umbra, remained in contact through psychic relay, their reports describing a fighting withdrawal through passages where reality itself had become unstable due to prolonged chaos corruption. The final phase of the withdrawal required the systematic destruction of Imperial installations throughout the tunnel network to prevent demon forces from using captured equipment and facilities. Demolition charges were placed at critical junctions and supply depots, their detonation timed to provide maximum disruption to demon operations, while allowing Imperial personnel to reach extraction points. The destruction of these facilities represented the elimination of months of construction work and the loss of irreplaceable archaeotech components that had been adapted for operation within the Webway's hostile environment. The Emperor's commencement of the sealing process began with the gradual redirection of psychic energy from the Astronomicon toward the dimensional barriers containing the demon incursion. The transition had to be managed carefully to prevent complete loss of navigational guidance for Imperial fleets scattered across the galaxy, yet the energy requirements for permanent barrier creation demanded nearly his entire psychic output. The compromise solution involved cycling power between functions in carefully timed intervals, creating brief periods where either the barriers or the Astronomicon operated at reduced capacity while the other received maximum energy allocation. The physical toll of this process on the Emperor's form was immediate and severe, as his enhanced metabolism struggled to provide the energy necessary for sustained maximum psychic output. His cardiovascular system operated at levels that caused visible stress throughout his circulatory network, while neural activity readings showed patterns that exceeded the measurement capabilities of Imperial medical equipment. The life support systems integrated into the Golden Throne worked at maximum capacity to maintain basic biological functions, their archaeotech components generating heat signatures that required additional cooling systems to prevent catastrophic overload. The creation of permanent psychic barriers around the breach demanded techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, even for a being of the Emperor's transcendent abilities. The process involved weaving multiple layers of psychic energy into configurations that could exist independently of their creator's direct attention, while maintaining sufficient strength to contain entities whose power operated on cosmic scales. Each barrier layer required different harmonic frequencies and geometric patterns, creating a complex matrix of interlocking defenses that could adapt to various forms of demon assault while maintaining structural integrity over geological time periods. The sealing operation's completion marked the end of humanity's greatest attempt to transcend its dependence on warp travel and achieve independence from the forces of chaos. The Imperial Webway Gate, which had represented the culmination of the Emperor's vision for mankind's future, was permanently sealed behind barriers that would require his constant vigilance to maintain. The tunnel network beyond these barriers remained infested with demon forces, whose presence would continue to test the containment systems for as long as the barriers endured. The Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne became a permanent condition, as his consciousness was bound to the task of maintaining the psychic seals that prevented demonic breakthrough. His physical form, already showing signs of severe deterioration from months of strain, would require constant life support to sustain the biological processes necessary for continued psychic projection. The Master of Mankind, who had once strode across battlefields as humanity's greatest champion, was now imprisoned within a device that had become both life support system and psychic amplifier. The daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers became necessary to provide the psychic energy required to supplement the Emperor's own diminishing reserves. These unfortunate souls, drawn from the Black Ship's cargo of psychically gifted individuals, would have their life force drained to fuel the barriers that kept Terra safe from demonic invasion. The process represented a grim irony, as the Emperor's attempt to free humanity from dependence on psychers had instead created a system that consumed them at an unprecedented rate to maintain the very defenses his failure had made necessary. The long-term consequences of the Webway project's failure extended throughout the Imperium, as humanity remained trapped in its dangerous relationship with warp travel and the Navigator houses. The monopolistic control exercised by Navigator families over interstellar transportation would continue indefinitely, preventing the development of alternative methods that might have reduced the species' vulnerability to chaos corruption. Imperial fleets would remain dependent on Geller fields and Navigator guidance to traverse the Immaterium's treacherous currents, with every journey carrying the risk of demon incursion or complete loss in the warp's chaotic depths. The sealed breach beneath the Imperial Palace became a constant reminder of humanity's greatest failure and the price of hubris in attempting to master forces beyond mortal comprehension. The ongoing threat that remained contained behind the Emperor's psychic barriers would require eternal vigilance, with any weakening of the defenses potentially releasing demon hordes directly into Terra's heart. The Master of Mankind's sacrifice had prevented immediate catastrophe, but at the cost of binding him to a prison of his own making for the remainder of human history. The Emperor's eternal vigil upon the Golden Throne represented both humanity's salvation and its damnation, preserving the species from annihilation while simultaneously condemning it to a future of perpetual struggle against the forces of chaos. His vision of human transcendence had been replaced by the grim necessity of endless sacrifice, with 1,000 souls offered daily to maintain the barriers that kept the darkness at bay. The war in the Webway had ended not in victory or defeat, but in a stalemate that would define the character of human civilization for 10,000 years to come.